Section 1. The show that made lawyers rich. There is something almost uniquely American about the idea of a cartoon causing a $2 million federal lawsuit. Most animated shows, even the ones with sharp edges and rough humor, quietly go about their business without landing anyone in a courtroom. They make their jokes, stir their small controversies, maybe get a complaint letter or two, and then everybody moves on. But Family Guy was different. Family Guy seemed almost magnetically drawn toward legal trouble, not because the people making it were reckless or incompetent, but because the show built its entire identity around the one kind of comedy that lawyers have never stopped arguing about: parody, satire. The humor that borrows from reality and twists it until something uncomfortable becomes something funny, or at least something that the show's creators hoped would be funny. And so, across the years, real people found themselves in real courtrooms arguing about what a cartoon said about them. A beloved comedian who had spent decades building one of the most iconic characters in television history stared at a piece of paperwork that said her creation had been placed in an adult bookstore. A music publisher held up sheet music and told a federal judge that a cartoon dog owner singing to the night sky was somehow destroying their copyright. An actor who had spent years performing a beloved comedy bit on The Tonight Show watched a clip of Jesus Christ doing what he believed was his routine and decided the time for a lawsuit had finally arrived. These are not small or silly stories, even though many of them involve cartoons and fake magic tricks and a fictional family from a fictional town in Rhode Island. These are stories about where the law draws its lines, about what counts as protected speech and what counts as theft, about how much a person can own their own image, their own character, their own song. And because they involve Family Guy, a show that has been airing since the 31st of January 1999 and has refused to stop airing no matter what anyone does about it, these stories also touch on something larger. They touch on what it means to be famous in an era when anyone with an animation studio and a network slot can put your face and your voice and your most cherished creation into whatever scenario they find funny that week. So settle in, get comfortable. Wherever you are reading or listening to this, let yourself relax into it, because we are going to walk through every real person who went to court over this show, taking each case slowly and carefully, spending time with the people involved, the episodes that sparked the conflict, the legal arguments that were made, the judges who had to sit through arguments about song parodies and cartoon janitors, and the outcomes that rippled outward through copyright law and entertainment for years after. We start, as so many things about Family Guy start, with a question about how much a joke can actually get away with. The show premiered in a simpler media moment. The 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33 on Fox, and it pulled in roughly 22 million viewers for that first episode, a staggering number for a brand new animated show, though the Super Bowl lead-in gave it a significant artificial boost. But even after that initial spike passed, people stayed. The first full season averaged 12.8 million households. That was not a fluke. Something about the show connected. Its creator, Seth MacFarlane, was 26 years old when Family Guy premiered. He had grown up in Kent, Connecticut, attended the Rhode Island School of Design, and spent time working as an animator and writer for Hanna-Barbera, putting in hours on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He had created 2 short films in the mid-90s, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, that featured a man and his talking dog. And those shorts were the clear ancestors of Peter and Brian Griffin. Fox executives saw those films, liked what they found, gave MacFarlane a green light and a budget, and the rest is a very long, very loud, very litigated history. But what made Family Guy different from its animated contemporaries, and what made it a lightning rod for legal action, was something baked into its structure from the very beginning. The show was built around the idea that nothing was entirely off-limits as a target. Politicians, celebrities, religions, historical figures, recent tragedies, beloved cultural institutions, children's films, national heroes, all of it was potential raw material for a joke. And the show did not work with subtle, nuanced observation. It worked with the blunt force of the cutaway gag, that signature move where a character would say something like, "This is worse than the time I," and the screen would cut to something entirely unrelated, playing out a joke in miniature, then cutting back to the main story like nothing had happened. Those cutaway gags were hilarious when they worked. They were also, it turned out, exactly the kind of comedy that could get a studio sued. Because the cutaway gag lives by borrowing. It lives by referencing. It lives by taking something from the real world, a real song, a real person, a real act, a real image, and putting it into a context designed to generate laughter. Sometimes that borrowing was clearly transformative, clearly parodic, clearly protected. Sometimes it was legally murkier. And occasionally, the people being borrowed from noticed, and they had opinions about it, and those opinions came with legal teams attached. So this is the story of those legal battles. Every real person who decided that the joke had gone too far and that a federal judge should hear about it. We will spend real time with each of them, who they were, what they built, what Family Guy did with it, how the courts responded, and what it all means for the strange intersection of comedy and copyright that Family Guy inhabits more fully than almost any other show in television history. Before we get into the first lawsuit, though, and we are going to spend a long time on each one, so you have plenty of material to drift along with. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching or listening from and what time it is there. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that this is reaching people in different time zones, different parts of the world, different moments of their day or night. And if you have not already, please subscribe. It means more than you know. Section 2. The show that was built to offend Family Guy's DNA and why lawsuits were almost inevitable. To understand why so many real people ended up in courtrooms over Family Guy, you have to spend some time understanding what kind of show Family Guy actually was at its core, not just what it looked like on the surface, with its bright colors and its familiar sitcom family setup and its cheerful theme song, but what it was built to do at a deeper level. Seth MacFarlane was not, at his heart, a gentle comedian. He was an aggressive one. He admired the shock and awe approach to humor that had been pioneered by shows like The Simpsons in its early seasons and refined by the adult animation movement of the late 90s. He grew up watching not just cartoons but the broader tradition of American comedy, which includes a long and distinguished history of celebrities and public figures being relentlessly mocked by people who were technically allowed to do so. Saturday Night Live, The Carol Burnett Show, ironically enough, Mad Magazine, National Lampoon. All of these had spent decades putting famous faces in undignified situations and calling it comedy, and all of them had operated under the general legal understanding that parody, the act of imitating something in order to comment on or ridicule, it is protected speech under American law. MacFarlane took that tradition and poured it into the vessel of a network-animated sitcom, and then he turned the dial up significantly. Family Guy was not trying to be tasteful. It was not trying to be subtle. It was, from almost the very beginning, a show that prided itself on making people uncomfortable, along with making them laugh. It trafficked in offensive stereotypes deployed ironically, in celebrity mockery that was frequently cruel, in jokes about tragedies and taboos that other shows would never touch. And it wrapped all of this in the bright, cheerful aesthetic of a family cartoon, which made the contrast more jarring and, for many viewers, more funny. MacFarlane himself voiced 4 of the show's main characters: Peter Griffin, the bumbling patriarch; Brian Griffin, the erudite talking dog; Stewie Griffin, the infant with world domination ambitions; and Glenn Quagmire, the show's resident sex-obsessed neighbor. He was also deeply involved in the writing and creative direction during the early seasons, building a writer's room that included sharp, boundary-pushing comedians who shared his appetite for provocation. The original writing team included Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These were not people who were going to suggest that the show dial back its ambitions to avoid stepping on toes. What this meant in practice was a show that, from its very earliest episodes, was doing things that other network animated shows were not doing. It was making jokes about AIDS on primetime television in ways that AIDS advocacy organizations found deeply offensive. It was depicting characters based on real celebrities in humiliating scenarios. It was parodying children's movies, beloved songs, sacred religious figures, and cultural icons with the same blithe energy it brought to jokes about beer and football. And it was doing all of this inside a format, the animated sitcom, that still carried some residual sense of being family-friendly programming, simply by virtue of being drawn rather than live action. That disconnect was the show's secret weapon creatively, and it was also the thing that made it legally combustible. Because when you build a show around the idea that any public figure or any cultural artifact is fair game for parody and mockery, you are making a bet that American copyright and publicity law agrees with you. And American copyright and publicity law, as it turned out, agreed with that bet, but only sometimes, and only under specific conditions, and only after the people and publishers and estates who disagreed had gone through the trouble of taking the matter to court. The legal framework that governed all of these disputes was not new. Parody as a form of protected speech has a long history in American jurisprudence, stretching back well before Family Guy's premiere. The Supreme Court had clarified matters enormously in 1994 with its ruling in Campbell v. Acuff Rose Music, Inc., which involved the rap group 2 Live Crew and their parody of Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman. In that decision, the court held that parody defined as a work that comments on or critiques the original work it imitates can qualify as fair use, even when it borrows substantial portions of the original. The key is transformation. A parody transforms its source material in a way that adds new meaning, new comment, new perspective. A simple copy does not transform, but a genuine parody, even an extremely crude one, has a legitimate claim on the material it borrows from. That ruling became the cornerstone of virtually every lawsuit Family Guy ever faced. Whenever the show ended up in court, the question was always some version of the same thing. Was what Family Guy did a genuine parody? Something that commented on or transformed the original? Or was it just borrowing the original's music or character or likeness for the sake of a joke that had nothing to do with the original itself? The lawyers called this second thing satire, as opposed to parody, and satire gets much less legal protection. If you use someone's song to make a joke about the song itself, that is parody, and courts look favorably on it. If you use someone's song to make a joke about something entirely unrelated, just because the song is recognizable and funny, that is satire and you may well be on the hook for it. Family Guy walked this line repeatedly, sometimes gracefully, sometimes stumbling, sometimes getting lucky, and sometimes settling out of court with undisclosed terms that we can only speculate about from a distance. There is another layer to all of this that is worth understanding before we get into the individual cases, and that is the question of right of publicity. Beyond copyright, which protects creative works like songs and characters, American law also recognizes something called the right of publicity, which is a person's right to control how their name, likeness, and identity are used commercially. This right is recognized differently in different states, and its scope varies considerably, but in general, it gives real people some legal recourse when they feel their identity has been used without permission in ways that damage their reputation or benefit someone else commercially. The right of publicity was going to come up repeatedly in Family Guy's legal history, particularly in the Carol Burnett case, and understanding what it does and does not protect is essential context for what follows. One more piece of background worth establishing is the nature of 20th Century Fox as a defendant. Family Guy was produced by Seth MacFarlane's production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, in partnership with 20th Century Fox Television, and it aired on the Fox Broadcasting Company. In every single lawsuit the show faced, it was Fox in one or more of its corporate incarnations that bore the primary legal weight of the defense. MacFarlane was often named personally as well, along with specific writers and producers depending on which episode was at issue. But Fox was the entity with the deepest pockets and the most expansive legal resources. When Family Guy won cases, which it mostly did, it won them through Fox's lawyers arguing successfully for First Amendment protections and fair use doctrine. When Family Guy settled cases, which it did at least once that we know of, it settled with Fox's money. This context matters because it shapes how we think about these lawsuits. The people suing were almost never suing Seth MacFarlane, the individual, out of personal animosity. They were suing a major broadcast network and its associated studio because they believed that studio had taken something that belonged to them, a character, a song, a performance, a likeness, and had used it without permission for commercial gain. And they were entering a legal system that, at least in the United States, has historically been quite skeptical of censoring comedy, quite protective of parody, and quite unwilling to let hurt feelings, even genuinely legitimate hurt feelings, override the First Amendment. That was the world Family Guy operated in. That was the set of rules it played by. And it won. almost every time. Because the law in America is very much on the side of people who make jokes about famous things. But winning in court is not always the same as being right, and understanding why the people who sued had legitimate grievances even when they lost is as important as understanding why the courts ruled the way they did. With all of that foundation laid, let us begin with the first and in many ways the most famous legal challenge the show ever faced. A case involving one of the most beloved figures in the history of American television comedy, a character that lived in the Smithsonian, and a pornography store that was described as very clean. Section 3. Carol Burnett vs. Fox. The Charwoman goes to court. Carol Burnett has one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of American entertainment. Born on the 26th of April, 1933, in San Antonio, Texas, she grew up in a household with significant challenges. Her parents struggled with alcoholism, and she was raised largely by her maternal grandmother, Mabel Louise White, who took her to the movies regularly and instilled in her a love of storytelling and performance. That grandmother was not just a formative figure in Burnett's personal life. She was woven into the very fabric of Burnett's public persona in a way that would become central to one of the strangest corporate legal disputes in television history. Burnett studied theater and musical comedy at UCLA, moved to New York, and broke through on Broadway in 1959 with her role in Once Upon a Mattress. She became a regular on The Gary Moore Show in the early 1960s, earned a Tony nomination, won a Grammy for a comedy album, and by the mid-1960s had become one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment. But it was the show that ran from 1967 to 1978. The Carol Burnett Show on CBS that cemented her legacy. For 11 seasons, Burnett presided over one of the great variety programs in American television history, winning more than 24 Emmy and Golden Globe Awards and creating a cast of recurring characters that became genuinely iconic. One of those characters was the Charwoman. If you grew up watching American television in the late 60s and 70s, the Charwoman was immediately recognizable, a broom-wielding cleaning woman with a mop of wild hair and a dreamy, wistful quality, always dressed in her cleaning uniform, always seeming like she had wandered in from somewhere else and was quietly imagining a more glamorous life. Burnett played her with an enormous amount of gentle comedy and genuine warmth. The Charwoman was not a joke character exactly. She was something richer, a portrait of working-class dignity and imagination, the kind of person who scrubs floors for a living but whose inner life is vast and romantic and full of music. Burnett's physical comedy, her extraordinary facial expressiveness, her instinct for pathos wrapped in humor, all of it was poured into this character. The Charwoman's costume, the one Burnett wore on the show, is housed in the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. That tells you something about the cultural weight of this character. This was not a minor bit, not a throwaway gag, not a one-episode joke that people forgot about the moment it ended. This was a character that had entered the cultural consciousness of an entire generation of Americans, a character that Burnett had built over years and that carried with it all the personal and professional significance that comes from spending 11 years pouring yourself into a creation. The origin of the Charwoman goes back even further than the show. Burnett has told the story of hearing the song The Stripper on the radio and picturing a housewife doing the stripper's walk while ironing, vacuuming, and doing ordinary domestic tasks. That image, the gap between the glamorous and the mundane, the inner life that runs alongside and beneath the surface of ordinary working life, was the seed of the character. And crucially, the Charwoman was tied to one of the most famous personal traditions in American television. At the end of every episode of The Carol Burnett Show, Burnett would tug at her ear as she said goodbye to the audience. It was her signal to her grandmother, who watched the show faithfully and to whom that ear tug was a private goodnight. When Burnett tugged her ear, she was not performing for the cameras. She was reaching across the television to her grandmother. That gesture became so well known, so associated with the Charwoman and with Burnett herself, that it became one of her defining public signatures, personal, tender, and universally recognized. Now, in April 2006, Family Guy aired an episode called Peterotica. The episode was part of the show's 4th season, the first full season after the show had been brought back from cancellation in 2005, and it revolved around Peter Griffin's adventures in writing erotic fiction. Near the beginning of the episode, Peter and his friends, including Glenn Quagmire, walk into an adult bookstore called Pornoslavia XXX, which is, as the show cheerfully notes, formerly a Kenny Rogers Roasters. Peter is surprised to find the store clean. Quagmire, casual as ever, explains the cleanliness with a single throwaway line. Carol Burnett works part-time as a janitor. The camera then panned to an animated figure that was unmistakably the charwoman, complete with the mop, the costume, the distinctive look cleaning the floor of the pornography store. In the background, a modified version of Carol's theme, the song associated with the Carol Burnett show's closing segment, was playing. One character then made a joke about Burnett's ear tug, asking what she tugged to say goodnight to her mother. Another responded with a crude sexual comment about what she tugged to say goodnight to her father. The entire scene lasted approximately 18 seconds. 18 seconds of screen time. And those 18 seconds resulted in a federal lawsuit seeking more than $2 million in damages. It is worth pausing here to understand why Burnett reacted the way she did, because the easy version of this story, famous person gets upset about a brief joke and runs to a lawyer, misses something important. Burnett had spent decades not just creating the charwoman but carefully protecting her. The character was copyrighted. The show's theme song was copyrighted. The ear tug was associated with one of the most intimate personal traditions in Burnett's life. To have all of that, the copyright, the character, the signature gesture, the beloved theme song dropped into a scene set in a pornography store, without her permission, without any attempt to contact her, without any conversation about whether this was acceptable, felt to Burnett like a violation of something genuinely significant. It is also worth noting that Burnett herself had built her career on comedy that pushed limits, on satire and parody of public figures, on sketch comedy that did things with well-known images and songs and characters. She knew the tradition. She understood what parody was, and she felt that what Family Guy had done was different, that putting the charwoman in a pornography store, using her theme song, making crude sexual jokes about her most personal gesture, went beyond the kind of commentary that parody law was designed to protect and into something that simply borrowed her creation to make a dirty joke. In March 2007, roughly a year after the episode aired, Burnett and her company Wacko Inc. filed a lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Central District of California. The suit named 20th Century Fox Film Corporation as the primary defendant. The legal claims were specific: copyright infringement, statutory violation of the right of publicity, and misappropriation of name and likeness, and unfair competition. Burnett was asking for at least $2 million in damages. More importantly, she was asking the court to order Fox to remove all references to her from the episode, to cut the charwoman, to remove the modified theme music, to excise the ear tug jokes from all future airings and releases. Fox refused. The studio held firm, declining to make any edits to the episode, and instead prepared to defend itself on the grounds that what Family Guy had done was legally protected parody. The legal arguments that Fox made were rooted firmly in the framework established by Campbell v. Acuff Rose. Fox's lawyers argued that the charwoman scene was a genuine parody, that it used the recognizable image of the charwoman and the familiar notes of the show's theme not simply to borrow them for a cheap laugh, but to lampoon and mock Carol Burnett and the charwoman as public figures, which is precisely the kind of transformative use that parody law is designed to protect. They pointed to Burnett's own history as a comedian who had built her career on parodying other people's work, noting the irony that the woman who had made a career of satirizing famous things and famous people was now seeking to prevent others from satirizing her. Fox also argued that there was no possible market confusion between the charwoman and the pederotica scene. Nobody watching the episode was going to think Carol Burnett had actually endorsed or participated in the pornography store, or that the charwoman character was officially being used in adult entertainment. Burnett's lawyers pushed back on several fronts. They argued, with some legal sophistication, that the scene did not actually parody the charwoman as a creative work, that it did not comment on or critique what the character represented or what Burnett had done with it. Instead, they argued, it simply placed the charwoman in a degrading situation in order to make a crude joke, which is satire rather than parody. Because the scene was making a joke about the general concept of a famous person working an embarrassing part-time job, using the charwoman as the vehicle, the lawyers argued that this fell outside the narrow protection that parody law provides. They also raised the ear tug issue separately, pointing out that the ear tug was not a feature of the charwoman character as a fictional creation. It was a gesture Burnett herself made as Carol Burnett at the end of the show as a personal message to her grandmother. By having characters in the episode make sexual jokes about the ear tug, Family Guy was not parodying a fictional character. It was making crude sexual jokes about a real person's most intimate personal gesture. The case came before United States District Judge Dean D. Pregerson. And on the 4th of June 2007, Judge Pregerson dismissed Burnett's complaint. The ruling was a victory for Fox and for Family Guy, and it was built on the core legal principle that parody of public figures is protected speech under the First Amendment, regardless of how crude or distasteful that parody might be. Judge Pregerson was not gentle about the show's handling of Burnett. He acknowledged in the ruling that the segment was distasteful and bizarre, even outrageous and offensive. He was explicit about that. He was not saying Family Guy's joke was good or kind or appropriate. He was saying it was protected. He quoted from Hustler magazine v. Falwell, the 1988 Supreme Court case, that had held that even vehement, caustic, and unpleasant attacks on public figures fall within the zone of First Amendment protection as long as a reasonable person would not mistake the parody for a factual claim. Nobody watching Family Guy, Pregerson reasoned, would have thought Carol Burnett actually worked part-time as a janitor at a pornography store. The judge also addressed the transformation question directly. He found that Family Guy had taken enough of the charwoman's visual identity, the costume, the mop, the distinctive look to make the parody recognizable, but had placed that image in a context so different from the original that it constituted genuine transformation. Burnett's charwoman was a figure of warmth and dignity. Family Guy's deployment of that same image in a pornography store was not just a different context, it was a deliberate inversion, a mockery of the original that, however crude, qualified as commentary on the original. The ruling also addressed Burnett's right of publicity claims. In California, as in most states, the right of publicity protects against the commercial use of a person's name or likeness for advertising or product endorsement. But Pregerson found that Family Guy's use did not constitute commercial exploitation in that sense. The show was not using Burnett's image to sell a product or to suggest her endorsement of a product. It was using her image as part of a comedy program, and comedy programs have broad First Amendment protection. Carol Burnett received nothing from the lawsuit. Fox never edited the episode. The charwoman remained in the pornography store on every subsequent airing of Pederotica, and the modified theme music kept playing, and the jokes about the ear tug were never cut. From a strictly legal standpoint, Family Guy had won completely. But the story does not quite end there, because the ruling set something in motion that would continue to echo through the show's legal history. Pregerson's comments about the nature of parody, about when a public figure's creation can be used without permission, and how much transformation is required to make that use legitimate, became part of the legal landscape that every subsequent Family Guy lawsuit had to navigate. The Burnett case was, in a strange way, both a legal victory for the show and a kind of moral rebuke. The judge had said very clearly, this is allowed, but he had also said equally clearly, this is distasteful, offensive, and crude. The First Amendment does not care about taste, but the people who made Family Guy perhaps should have. There is a coda to the Burnett story that is worth carrying with you as we move through the rest of these cases. Burnett's ear tug, the gesture that Family Guy's joke was aimed at, was a signal to her grandmother. Mabel Louise White, the woman who raised her, who took her to movies, who taught her to love stories. Burnett tugged her ear at the end of every single episode of her show for 11 years, sending that goodnight signal across the airwaves. The Family Guy scene asked, in crude terms, what she tugged for her father. And whatever Pregerson said about the First Amendment, there is something in that detail, the private family gesture being made the subject of public crude humor, that sits a little differently once you know what the gesture actually meant. The law said it was allowed. The law was right, in its way. But sometimes the law being right does not mean the joke was worth making. Section 4. The episode Fox wouldn't air, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and The Long Road to a Lawsuit. Before a music publisher could sue Family Guy over a song, the song had to exist. And before the song existed, the episode it came from had to get made. And before that episode made it to air well, it almost did not make it to air at all. which is one of the more interesting backstories in the show's complicated history with controversy. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is officially classified as the 22nd and final episode of Family Guy's third season. But calling it part of the third season is somewhat misleading, because the episode was actually written and produced during the show's second season, in 2000. It was intended to air in December of that year, around the time of Hanukkah, and it was conceived as the show's holiday-themed installment for that year. Seth MacFarlane, who had by this point built a writer's room in which a significant majority of the staff identified as Jewish, he would later note that about 70% of the show's writers were Jewish, including Ricky Blitt, who wrote this particular episode, felt that an episode satirizing stereotypes about Jewish people and money was entirely within the show's wheelhouse. He even consulted with two rabbis while developing the episode's script, and both of them, apparently, approved it on the grounds that Peter learns the right lesson in the end. Fox executives felt differently. When they reviewed the completed episode in 2000, they made the decision not to air it, citing concerns that the content could be interpreted as anti-Semitic. This was not a decision about quality. The episode was finished, post-production complete, ready to broadcast. Fox simply chose not to. The episode was shelved, and it sat in the vault through the rest of the second season, through all of the third season, through the show's cancellation in 2002, through the years of reruns on Adult Swim and DVD sales that eventually built the momentum to bring the show back. The episode finally premiered on the 9th of November 2003 on Adult Swim Cartoon Network's late-night block before the show's revival on Fox had even been officially announced. It aired on DVD in September 2003 as a bonus episode on the third season set and then on Adult Swim 2 months later. MacFarlane himself introduced the Adult Swim, airing with a wry comment about Fox deciding the episode was too risky, joking that too risky at Fox meant anything that did not feature Paris Hilton half-naked, on the hood of a car. He also clarified, for anyone who might be confused, that the episode was about Peter Griffin's misconceptions about the Jewish community, not an endorsement of those misconceptions. The episode eventually aired on Fox itself, on the 10th of December 2004, in a censored version. It was placed in the third season retroactively, becoming the season finale. Now, what actually happens in the episode? Peter, as he so often is in the early seasons, is a well-meaning disaster. He gets scammed by a man selling volcano insurance, of all things a policy completely useless in Rhode Island, which has no volcanoes and loses a significant amount of the family's money. Despondent, he overhears his friends Quagmire and Cleveland talking about how men with Jewish-sounding names have helped them with their finances. And Peter's extremely simple mind draws an equally simple conclusion. He needs a Jewish person to help him with money because Jewish people are better with money. This is, of course, a stereotype, and the episode knows it is a stereotype, and the comedy of the episode is built entirely around Peter's embarrassing and oblivious reliance on this stereotype, while the show simultaneously shows that Max Weinstein, the Jewish accountant who ends up helping Peter, is simply a competent professional and a decent person. But before any of that unfolds, there is a scene that would eventually put Family Guy in federal court. Feeling desperate after losing the money, Peter looks out his window at the night sky and begins to sing. He is standing at the window in a pose that directly mimics the classic scene from Walt Disney's 1940 animated film Pinocchio, where the toy maker Geppetto stands at his window wishing upon a star. Peter sings to the same general melody to the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star, the song from that film that had since become one of the most famous and recognizable songs in the history of American popular music. But the lyrics Peter sings are not Jiminy Cricket's hopeful words about dreams coming true. They are something quite different. Peter sings about needing a Jew to help him. The song is called I Need a Jew, and its lyrics balance between genuinely offensive stereotypes and the show's characteristic framing of Peter's ignorance as the actual target of mockery. The song was composed by Walter Murphy, who had been working as the show's music director, and it was written to sound unmistakably like When You Wish Upon a Star. That was deliberate. The joke required the audience to hear the familiar melody and feel the dissonance between the Disney original's warm, aspirational message and the crude, stereotyped request that Peter was singing. Without that recognizable melody, the joke would not have worked. Without the audience bringing their knowledge of Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket and the whole emotional weight of When You Wish Upon a Star to the moment, Peter's song would have been stripped of its satirical context. Family Guy's creative team knew they were using a copyrighted song. The process for using copyrighted music in a television production normally involves obtaining a license from the song's copyright holder, in this case, Bourne Company Music Publishers, a New York-based publishing firm that owned the sole American copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star. The show's producers actually reached out to Bourne Company and asked for permission to use the melody. Bourne Company refused. They were not interested in having their classic Disney song associated with the kind of comedy Family Guy was making. So the Family Guy creative team, having been turned down, proceeded anyway. They commissioned Murphy to write I Need a Jew to be close enough to When You Wish Upon a Star that the parody would be unmistakable, and they put it in the episode. For years, nothing happened. The episode aired. People laughed. People were offended. The usual Family Guy range of reactions followed. Bourne Company presumably watched and disapproved but took no action. Then, in October 2007, almost 4 years after the episode first aired on Adult Swim, Bourne Company filed a lawsuit against Fox and several associated parties. The timing was interesting. It was the 3rd of October 2007, and the internet had by then made it very easy for a music publisher to encounter a clip of an offending parody that had been posted on YouTube. The show's lawyers noted that Bourne Company apparently became aware of the clip through YouTube, which had launched in 2005 and had quickly become a repository for exactly the kind of short, shareable Family Guy moments that the cutaway gag format was designed to produce. Someone had clipped Peter's I Need a Jew song and uploaded it, and it had found its way to people at Bourne Company. The lawsuit named McFarlane, 20th Century Fox Film Corporation, Fox Broadcasting Company, Cartoon Network, Fuzzy Door Productions, and Walter Murphy. It sought unspecified damages and, crucially, asked the court to stop the program's distribution entirely to prevent any further airing or sale of the episode that contained the song. The legal theory behind the suit was precise and somewhat technical, and it is worth understanding in some detail because it turns on a distinction in copyright law that does not always get explained clearly. Bourne Company agreed. Their lawyers actually stated this in their legal filings, that I Need a Jew was intended to evoke When You Wish Upon a Star. There was no dispute about whether Family Guy had borrowed from the Disney song. The dispute was about what kind of borrowing it was, and whether that kind of borrowing was protected. Bourne's argument was this: I Need a Jew does not actually parody When You Wish Upon a Star. It does not comment on that song. It does not critique that song. It does not say anything about the song itself, or about Disney, or about the meaning of wishing upon a star. Instead, it uses the melody simply as a vehicle, a recognizable, well-loved tune that would make Peter's stereotyped request funnier by setting it against something innocent and sweet. This, Bourne argued, was satire rather than parody. The target of the joke was not When You Wish Upon a Star. The target of the joke was Jewish stereotypes, or Peter's ignorance, or American attitudes toward ethnic groups, all of these things. But none of them were the song itself. And satire, under American law, does not get the same free pass that parody does, because the satirist could, in theory, have made their satirical point without borrowing the specific copyrighted work they chose to borrow. This is actually a sophisticated legal argument, and it is not wrong exactly, it just did not persuade the court. But we will get to the ruling in the next section. For now, the important thing is that in October 2007, Bourne Company put Family Guy in a position where the show had to defend, in federal court, whether one of its most memorable musical moments was genuine parody or mere satire borrowing a beloved song to make a joke it could theoretically have made without that song. The timing of the lawsuit, arriving within 2 months of the Carol Burnett case being decided in Fox's favor, suggested that the show's legal victories were not necessarily discouraging people from trying. If anything, the Burnett ruling had clarified the legal battlefield, and Bourne Company was trying to maneuver onto terrain that the Burnett ruling had not yet covered. Burnett's case had been about character and likeness. Bourne's case was about music, and the specific legal questions around music parody were somewhat different. Bourne was betting that the distinction between parody and satire, as the courts had drawn it, would land on their side. Before we find out whether they were right, it is worth sitting with the episode for a moment and thinking about what it actually is. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein is, in the context of Family Guy's history, one of the more genuinely defended early episodes. It was made at a time when the show was still trying to do something with its provocative content, not just shock, but illuminate something about the way stereotypes work, about how a well-meaning but profoundly ignorant person can reduce a rich culture to a series of caricatures. The fact that the episode ended with Peter learning the right lesson, as the rabbi who approved the script noted, distinguishes it from many of the show's later, lazier forays into offensive territory. The song, crude as it was embedded in a story that was at least attempting to make a point about the absurdity of thinking about human beings in terms of ethnic capabilities. Whether that good faith effort to make a point changes anything legally is a different question. And it is a question that a federal judge was going to have to answer. Section 5. Born Company Music Publishers versus 20th Century Fox, Disney's Song, Peter's Sin, and the Fair Use Doctrine. On the 16th of March 2009, United States District Judge Deborah A. Batts of the Southern District of New York issued her ruling in Born Co. v. 20th Century Fox Film Corporation. The case had been building for a year and a half. The lawyers had filed their motions. The briefs had been submitted, the legal arguments had been fully developed and explored. And on that March morning, Judge Batts granted summary judgment for the defendants, meaning she ruled in Fox's favor without the case going to a full trial because the legal issues were sufficiently clear on the undisputed facts. Family Guy had won again. But the path to that victory, and the reasoning Judge Batts used to reach it, was considerably more interesting and more legally nuanced than the Burnett decision had been. Understanding that reasoning takes us into the heart of how American copyright law thinks about the relationship between comedy and creativity, between borrowing and stealing, between the culture's right to comment on itself and a songwriter's right to protect what they made. Judge Batts began by establishing the basic facts clearly. Born Company owned the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star. The song had been written for the 1940 Disney film Pinocchio, and it had since become one of the most recognizable songs in the American Songbook, an Oscar winner, a cultural touchstone, a melody that functioned almost as a symbol of innocent aspiration in the American imagination. The song was at the absolute core of copyright protection, a well-known, commercially significant, widely beloved creative work. Born Company was its sole American copyright owner, and they had the legal right to control how it was used. The question was whether Family Guy's use of the melody constituted infringement or whether it was protected as fair use. Fair use, under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, is a doctrine that allows people to use copyrighted material without permission under certain circumstances for purposes like criticism, comment, education, journalism, or parody. The courts have developed a four-factor test for determining whether a particular use qualifies as fair use. Those four factors are the purpose and character of the use, including whether it is commercial, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion used, and the effect of the use on the potential market for the copyrighted work. The key wrinkle in this case, as Born Company's lawyers had identified with some legal precision, was the parody versus satire distinction. Under the Campbell v. Acuff-Rose framework from 1994, a parody defined as a work that imitates and comments on the original work has more latitude to borrow from the original than a satire does. This is because a parody, by definition, needs to use enough of the original to make the original recognizable, because it is the original being commented upon. But a satire could make its satirical point without borrowing from any specific copyrighted work and therefore does not get the same level of legal protection. Born Company's argument was that I Need a Jew was satire, not parody. The song, they said, was satirizing anti-Semitism and Jewish stereotypes, real-world targets that had nothing to do with When You Wish Upon a Star, or with Jiminy Cricket, or with Walt Disney's film. The melody of When You Wish Upon a Star was just a vehicle, Born argued, a convenient, recognizable tune that Family Guy had attached to a satirical message about stereotype and prejudice. Family Guy could have made the same satirical point without using the melody. Therefore, the use was not parody. It was satire. It did not need to borrow from When You Wish Upon a Star, and using the melody without permission was copyright infringement. It was a clean argument. It had a certain logic. and Judge Batts found it unpersuasive. The core of Batts's analysis was her finding that I Need a Jew was parody, genuine parody, because it did comment on When You Wish Upon a Star itself, and not just on Jewish stereotypes. Her reasoning was layered and worth following carefully. First, Batts found that I Need a Jew commented on the warm and fuzzy worldview of When You Wish Upon a Star. The Disney song presents a picture of reality in which wishing upon a star, pure, innocent aspiration, can make dreams come true. It is an achingly optimistic song. It says that if you want something badly enough, and if your heart is pure, the universe will provide it. This is, Judge Batts noted with a certain judicial dryness, a fantasy. Wishing upon a star does not, in fact, make dreams come true. By pairing that fantasy melody with Peter's extremely literal, extremely unmagical, extremely stereotyped request for a specific ethnic minority to come and fix his financial problems, I Need a Jew was commenting on the childishness of When You Wish Upon a Star's worldview. It was saying, this is what wishing upon a star actually looks like when you bring it down to earth. A stupid man hoping that belonging to a particular ethnic group confers special abilities. Second, Batts found a second layer of parody in the song's possible commentary on Walt Disney's own alleged anti-Semitism. This is a well-documented historical question. Disney had associations during his lifetime with anti-Semitic organizations, and his personal views on Jewish people have been the subject of considerable historical scrutiny. By having Peter sing a song saturated in Jewish stereotypes to the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star, I Need a Jew, could reasonably be understood as a comment on that history, a juxtaposition of Disney's anti-Semitic associations with the innocent, beloved quality of his music. Third, Batts found that the two songs were not simply the same song with different lyrics. She noted that Murphy's composition was close to, but not identical to the original. It was intended to evoke the original strongly enough that the parody would land, but it was its own composition. The lyrics were, in the court's characterization, almost entirely different from the original and strikingly different in tone and message. The first factor of the fair use test purpose and character of the use weighed heavily in Fox's favor, Batts found, because the song was sufficiently transformative. On the second factor, the nature of the copyrighted work, Batts gave it little weight, consistent with Supreme Court guidance that says this factor matters less in parody cases because parodies almost always borrow from well-known, publicly significant works. Of course, I Need a Jew borrowed from a famous song. It had to, in order to make the parody recognizable. On the third factor, the amount and substantiality of what was used, Batts found that Fox and Murphy had used enough of When You Wish Upon a Star to make the parody work, but not more than necessary. They had taken enough to conjure up the original in the audience's mind, which is precisely what a parody needs to do. The fourth factor effect on the market for the copyrighted work was the one Bourne Company argued most strenuously. They claimed that I Need a Jew would damage the market for licensed uses of When You Wish Upon a Star by associating the beloved melody with anti-Semitic stereotypes. Batts dismissed this argument with some sharpness, noting that accepting Bourne's interpretation of the fourth factor would essentially swallow it whole under Bourne's logic. Any parody that used a well-loved song in a negative context would be deemed to harm that song's market value, which would eliminate the parody protection that courts had spent decades building. She also found that I Need a Jew was so different from When You Wish Upon a Star in tone and message that the two songs occupied entirely different markets. Nobody seeking to use When You Wish Upon a Star for a sincere, positive purpose was going to be affected by the existence of I Need a Jew. Summary judgment for the defendants. The song was parody, fair use applied, the lawsuit was dismissed. There is a fascinating footnote to this case that involves the very act of bringing the lawsuit. When Batts noted in her ruling that Family Guy's producers had actually approached Bourne Company before making the episode and asked for permission to use the melody, and that Bourne Company had refused, this fact became part of the legal analysis. Batts made clear that refusing to license a parody does not eliminate the fair use defense for that parody. Copyright holders do not have the right to veto criticism of themselves or their work. This is a principle that has profound implications for comedy and satire in the digital age, when rights holders have more tools than ever to police how their intellectual property is used. In other words, Bourne Company said no. Family Guy made the song anyway. Family Guy was right to do so, legally speaking, because a song copyright does not give you the right to prevent people from parodying your song. You can control how your song is used commercially. You cannot control what happens when someone uses it to make a point about your song. This ruling, combined with the Burnett ruling, established two important principles that would shape Family Guy's legal landscape going forward. Public figures cannot stop the show from parodying them in crude ways. Copyright holders cannot stop the show from parodying their songs in offensive ways. Both protections flow from the same source, the First Amendment's commitment to allowing culture to comment on itself. Even when that commentary is ugly, even when it hurts, even when the person being commented on is legitimately aggrieved. The show had now won two major federal cases in roughly 2 years. But a third lawsuit was already in motion, this one involving a man with a very different kind of magic act, a very different kind of career, and a very different outcome. Section 6. Art Metrano, the man who sued over Jesus' magic tricks. Art Metrano was born, Arthur Metrano, on the 22nd of September 1936 in Brooklyn, New York. He grew up in the borough's warm, comedic atmosphere, developing an instinct for performance that would carry him through a long and genuinely entertaining career. He worked the club circuit, developed an act, and eventually found his way to one of the most significant stages in American comedy, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. It was on The Tonight Show in 1970 that Art Metrano introduced the world to The Amazing Metrano, the comedy bit that would define his public persona for the rest of his life, and that would, almost 4 decades later, bring him into conflict with a cartoon. The Amazing Metrano was not a real magic act. It was a parody of magic acts, a gleeful, absurdist performance built around pretending to do tricks that were not actually tricks at all. The centerpiece was a move in which Metrano made his fingers appear to jump from one hand to the other, not through any sleight of hand or actual illusion, but through comically obvious manipulation, the kind of thing you might see a child do when pretending to be a magician. While performing this not trick, Metrano would hum the song Fine and Dandy, a jaunty 1930 composition by Kay Swift, with a contented, self-satisfied expression that suggested he was enormously pleased with his own magical prowess. The humor came entirely from the gap between Metrano's air of smug competence and the obvious fakeness of what he was doing. When he performed this act for Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, something remarkable happened. Carson, one of the most controlled presences in the history of American late-night television, a man who had seen thousands of acts and was genuinely difficult to break, fell off his chair laughing. Literally, he fell off the chair. Carson loved the bit so much that he signaled to Metrano to come sit at the desk with him after taking his bow, which was a huge honor, a comedian's dream, the signal that you had made it. Metrano described the moment later in interviews with enormous warmth. He knew in that instant that something special had happened. The Amazing Metrano, the humming fake magician with the jumping fingers, had landed. Metrano returned to The Tonight Show and other variety programs repeatedly over the following years, always with some version of the Amazing Metrano act, always to enthusiastic response. He became a recognizable figure in American comedy, the guy who hummed Fine and Dandy while doing fake magic and seemed absurdly delighted about it. Beyond the act, he built a solid career as a character actor, appearing in numerous television shows and films. His most prominent film work came in 1985 when he was cast as Lieutenant, later Captain, later Commandant Ernie Mauser in Police Academy 2, their first assignment, reprising the role in Police Academy 3, back in training, as the pompous, incompetent authority figure whom the lovably chaotic recruits of the Police Academy perpetually outwitted. Metrano was a genuinely funny presence in those films, playing self-important seriousness for maximum comedy. Then, on the 17th of September 1989, Metrano's life changed permanently and dramatically. He was working on the roof of his Los Angeles home when he fell from a ladder. The fall was catastrophic. He landed on his head, fracturing his first, second, and seventh vertebrae. He was left a quadriplegic paralyzed, his career as a physical comedian seemingly finished, his future deeply uncertain. What happened next says something remarkable about Metrano as a person. He recovered. Not completely, not to where he had been before the fall, but sufficiently to function, to move, to perform. He channeled the experience of his injury and recovery into a one-man show called Metrano's Accidental Comedy, later renamed Jews Don't Belong on Ladders, an accidental comedy. In this show, Metrano performed from his wheelchair, and near the end, he would stand up and take a few steps, which was itself a form of performance, because the audience knew about the fall, knew about the paralysis, and the act of standing was both a real accomplishment and a theatrical moment. The show raised more than $75,000 for project support for spinal cord injury, buying crutches and wheelchairs and supplies for disabled people. He had taken the worst thing that ever happened to him and made it into something that helped other people. That is not a small thing. Metrano continued performing and making occasional television appearances through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, though his on-screen work became less frequent after the fall. He officially retired from acting in 2001. And then, sometime in 2005, he became aware of a scene in Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story. Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story was a direct-to-DVD Family Guy film released on the 27th of September, 2005, running approximately 88 minutes. It was divided into 3 segments. The third segment, written by Steve Callahan, entitled Stu and Stewie's Excellent Adventure, involves Stewie traveling through time in his time machine. In the course of this time travel adventure, Stewie found himself in what appeared to be the time of Jesus Christ, and he remarked that the miracles of Jesus were perhaps exaggerated a bit. What followed was a cutaway showing Jesus Christ performing for a crowd of awed onlookers, and the performance Jesus was giving was unmistakably the amazing Metrano. Jesus was making his fingers jump from hand to hand. Jesus was humming, "Fine and dandy." The crowd was watching with the kind of reverence they might give to genuine miracles. The joke had multiple layers. It was making fun of Jesus, suggesting his famous miracles were no more impressive than a fake magic act. It was making fun of religious credulity, suggesting that people would look at cheap tricks with the same reverential awe they brought to sacred events. And it was, Metrano would later argue, borrowing his specific creative work, the finger-jumping routine, the specific song Fine and Dandy, the whole gestalt of the amazing Metrano act without his permission and without compensation. Initially, Metrano's lawyers reached out to Fox, and they apparently reached some kind of informal resolution in early 2008. Metrano withdrew his lawsuit, suggesting that he and Fox had found a way to resolve the matter without going to court, or so it seemed. But by September of 2008, Metrano had refiled his lawsuit, apparently because whatever arrangement had been reached had broken down. He was back in federal court, seeking damages of over $2 million, asserting copyright infringement in the amazing Metrano routine. The legal questions in this case were somewhat different from those in the Burnett and Bourne Company cases. Burnett's case had involved a character and a theme song. Bourne Company's case had involved a well-known published song. Metrano's case involved something more unusual, a performance. Could a comedian's live comedy act a specific series of gestures combined with a specific song performed in a specific way be protected by copyright? This was not entirely settled law, and it made Metrano's case more interesting legally than either of its predecessors. Metrano had actually tried to register the amazing Metrano routine with the United States Copyright Office, presumably to strengthen his case. The Copyright Office denied the registration request. This was a significant setback because it meant there was no registered copyright to point to. But copyright protection in the United States does not actually require formal registration. You own a copyright in an original creative work from the moment you create it. Registration simply makes the copyright easier to enforce and allows you to claim statutory damages. So the denial did not end Metrano's claim, it just made it harder to prosecute. Fox moved to dismiss the lawsuit, as defendants typically do when they feel the legal case against them is weak. In July 2009, Federal District Court Judge Philip S. Gutierrez heard Fox's motion to dismiss. His ruling was complicated and, in some ways, more favorable to Metrano than Fox had hoped. Gutierrez rejected the motion to dismiss on the first 3 of the 4 fair use factors: the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the infringed work, and the amount and substantiality of what was taken. On all 3 of those factors, the judge found that Metrano had a sufficient case to proceed. In other words, Fox did not get the quick dismissal they were seeking. But the court found something else that was legally quite significant. The scene made fun of Jesus and his followers, not of Metrano or his act. This was a subtle but important distinction. When Family Guy's Jesus did the amazing Metrano routine, the joke was about Jesus, about the idea that Jesus's miracles were no more impressive than a fake magic act. It was not making fun of Art Metrano. It was not saying the amazing Metrano act was bad or ridiculous. It was using the amazing Metrano act as a comparison point, saying that Jesus's miracles were comparable to this thing. This distinction, whether the parody targeted the original or used it as a reference point for a joke about something else, was exactly the parody versus satire question that had come up in the Bourne Company case, and it complicated Metrano's claim considerably. The case proceeded toward resolution, but it never reached a full trial. In 2010, Metrano and Fox reached a settlement, the terms of which were not publicly disclosed. Metrano, speaking later to The Hollywood Reporter, described the settlement as a very, very nice settlement, which suggests that while the specific figure remained confidential, it was enough that he considered the matter satisfactorily resolved. Art Metrano died on the 8th of September, 2021, at the age of 84, at his home in Aventura, Florida. His son, Harry, confirmed his death and noted that he had died of natural causes. In a statement, Metrano's family said he would have wanted everyone to smile when thinking of him, and to laugh, and to celebrate life. The amazing Metrano routine, the fingers jumping from hand to hand, the self-satisfied humming of fine and dandy, the air of absurd competence about a trick that is not a trick, remains one of the more joyful performances in the history of American comedy. It made Johnny Carson fall off his chair. It made Art Metrano a recognizable figure across more than 3 decades of American entertainment. And it made, in the hands of Jesus Christ in a Family Guy DVD, enough of an impression that Metrano spent 2 years arguing about it in federal court. He described the settlement as very nice. Given what the court had found about the fair use factors working in his favor, that description seems plausible. Family Guy's one definitively settled lawsuit where money actually changed hands, where the creator of the original work received something involved a humming fake magician from Brooklyn and a cartoon Jesus doing his act at the dawn of Christianity. There is something in that story that feels deeply right about both Family Guy and the American legal tradition. Anything can be a subject of comedy. Anything can be the subject of a lawsuit. Sometimes those two things happen to the same material at the same time, and the results are genuinely instructive about what we value and what we protect. Section 7. The Writers' Revolt, when MacFarlane sued his own network. All of the lawsuits we have discussed so far involve outside parties suing Family Guy people and publishers who felt the show had taken something from them. But there is another lawsuit in Family Guy's legal history that moves in the opposite direction, and it is in some ways the most revealing of all, because it exposes the fractures and tensions inside the show's own production process. On the 10th of April, 2006, Seth MacFarlane and 15 other Family Guy writers filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox Television in Santa Monica, California. The suit alleged breach of contract and deceit. The plaintiffs included Alex Borstein, the voice of Lois Griffin, who was also a credited writer on the show. The filing was made in the heart of the Family Guy revival era. Season 4 had just wrapped, Season 5 was in production, and the show was riding the crest of its comeback story. The lawsuit was about money. Specifically, it was about 12 minutes of additional footage. When Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, was released as a direct-to-DVD film in September 2005, the version released on DVD was slightly longer than the version of the material that had aired on television. The 3 segments that made up the film had been written to a feature-length runtime, but when Fox later aired the material as episodes during the 4th season finale on the 21st of May 2006, they cut the runtime down to approximately 66 minutes to fit the broadcast slot. Removing scenes, trimming moments, adjusting the pacing, those 12 minutes of additional footage that appeared in the DVD version represented additional writing work. MacFarlane and the other writers argued that under their contract with Fox, specifically under the terms set by the Writers Guild of America agreement, which governed the employment conditions of television writers covered by that union, they were entitled to additional payment for writing content that went beyond the standard episode length and appeared in a commercial release. They also claimed that Fox had failed to give them proper on-screen writing credit for certain elements of the project. Fox declined to comment on the lawsuit, as companies often do when first hit with legal action. The details of how the case was ultimately resolved are not publicly known. The Hollywood Reporter article that broke the news of the filing in April 2006 does not appear to have been followed by a public resolution. Announcement? Suggesting the matter was settled privately with terms that were not disclosed. But the lawsuit is worth sitting with for a moment, because of what it reveals about the relationship between Seth MacFarlane and the Fox network, a relationship that would become increasingly strained in the years to come. MacFarlane's public image was always deeply associated with Family Guy, and with Fox, he was the face of the show, the voice of the characters, the person whose name was on the credits. But behind that public face, the relationship between the show's creative team and the network that aired it was complicated and sometimes adversarial. The writers' lawsuit was the first public indication of that adversarial dimension. MacFarlane had made Fox a great deal of money. Family Guy was one of the network's most valuable properties, particularly after the success of the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales that had justified bringing the show back. The show's writers had contributed to that value. And here they were, within a year of the show's triumphant return, in a California courthouse arguing that Fox had violated their contract by not paying them for their work. It is worth noting the timing in the context of broader industry dynamics. The Writers Guild of America had been engaged in an ongoing struggle with major studios and networks over residuals payments to writers when their work is reused, aired in reruns, sold on DVD, or distributed in other secondary markets. These negotiations would eventually lead to the writers' strike of 2007 to 2008, the most significant labor action in Hollywood in decades, which MacFarlane would support prominently by walking off Family Guy and joining picket lines. The seeds of that larger conflict were already visible in the specific grievance MacFarlane and his colleagues were raising in their 2006 lawsuit, the question of who gets paid when content is used in ways beyond the original, agreed purpose, and how much they get paid, and whether the network's contractual obligations were being properly honored. The WGA agreement that governed the Family Guy writers' employment was not just a contract between individuals and a studio. It was the product of decades of collective bargaining between the Guild and the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. Every line of that agreement represented a negotiation between creative workers trying to protect their livelihoods and corporate entities trying to maximize their flexibility and minimize their costs. When MacFarlane and Borstein and the other 14 writers filed their lawsuit, they were not just asserting personal grievances. They were, in a sense, enforcing the Guild contract, testing whether Fox would actually honor the obligations it had agreed to. The fact that MacFarlane was both the creator of the show, the voice of its main characters, and a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the studio that produced and aired that show is one of the more unusual dynamics in the history of network television. It illuminates something about the nature of the relationship between creative talent and corporate production infrastructure that is easy to overlook when you are watching a cartoon about a hapless family in Rhode Island. The show looked like Seth MacFarlane's show. In the deepest creative sense, it was Seth MacFarlane's show. But the physical production of the show, the distribution of the show, the money that flowed from the show, all of that ran through Fox, and Fox was a corporation with its own financial interests that were not always aligned with MacFarlane's. This tension would deepen over the years. MacFarlane would become increasingly critical of Fox's broader institutional affiliations, particularly its connection to Fox News. In 2021, he would publicly post on social media that he wished Family Guy were on any other network, comparing his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. In 2020, he signed a deal with NBC Universal reportedly worth around $200 million, moving his new projects away from Fox entirely. The 2006 lawsuit, largely forgotten in the larger narrative of the show's history, can be read as an early signal of that eventual separation, the moment when the creator of one of Fox's most valuable properties and 15 of his colleagues had to go to court to get what they believed they were owed. It is also, for our purposes, the only lawsuit in Family Guy's history in which MacFarlane was not a defendant but a plaintiff, not the one being sued for what the show had done, but the one doing the suing, asserting his own rights against the network that had given his creation a home. There is something quietly significant in that inversion. Every other lawsuit we discuss involves someone trying to limit what Family Guy could say or borrow or parody. This one involves the people who made Family Guy trying to ensure that they were fairly compensated for what they had created. Both kinds of disputes are legal disputes about intellectual property and creative rights. But they point in very different directions, illuminating different aspects of how creative work gets made, owned, valued, and fought over in the American entertainment industry. Section 8. The Parents Television Council, America's most persistent complainers. Not everyone who wanted to take Family Guy down in court was suing over what the show had done to a specific person or a specific song. Some of the most sustained legal pressure on Family Guy came from an organization whose goal was not to protect a specific copyright or a specific individual, but to protect, as they saw it, the cultural environment in which American children were growing up. The Parents Television Council, known as the PTC, was founded in 1995 by L. Brent Bozell III, a conservative media critic, as a watchdog organization dedicated to monitoring the content of broadcast television and advocating for what the organization described as family-friendly programming. The PTC's model was straightforward. Identify episodes or moments on network television that they believed violated broadcast decency standards, generate complaints to the Federal Communications Commission, and apply pressure to advertisers to pull their support from programs the PTC found objectionable. The FCC, for those unfamiliar with the American broadcasting regulatory system, has statutory authority to fine broadcast networks for airing indecent content during hours when children are likely to be watching, specifically between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Indecent content, as defined by the FCC, is material that depicts or describes sexual or excretory organs or activities in a way that is patently offensive by contemporary community standards for the broadcast medium. The FCC does not regulate cable programming at all. Cable is a subscription service, and viewers pay for it voluntarily. But broadcast networks, which use the public airwaves, are subject to indecency regulation. Family Guy, which aired on the Fox broadcast network, was therefore within the PTC's regulatory crosshairs in a way that, say, content on HBO or Comedy Central was not. And the PTC targeted Family Guy with a consistency and an intensity that was genuinely remarkable. From the show's earliest seasons, the PTC placed episodes of Family Guy on its weekly Worst TV Show list with enough regularity that the designation eventually stopped feeling like a criticism and started feeling like a marketing endorsement. The PTC named Family Guy its worst primetime show on at least 40 separate occasions. Its newsletter became a fairly reliable guide to what Family Guy had done recently that was most likely to make viewers uncomfortable, and plenty of those viewers who might otherwise have missed the specific moments in question tuned in specifically because the PTC had told them not to. McFarlane's response to the PTC was characteristically unrestrained. In an interview with The Advocate, he compared receiving criticism from the PTC to getting hate mail from Hitler, saying they were literally terrible human beings who spent their entire day hating people. He pointed out, with some accuracy, that for an organization that prided itself on Christian values, the PTC seemed to devote an extraordinary amount of energy to consuming and cataloging the very content they found most offensive. He said they could all perform an anatomically ambitious act. He was, in short, not interested in de-escalating. The PTC filed formal FCC complaints against Family Guy episodes on multiple specific occasions. The episodes in question included "And the Wiener Is," which the PTC targeted for its repeated use of language relating to male anatomy; Family Gay, which became the record holder for FCC complaints; Business Guy, Brian and Stewie, and others. The FCC reviewed these complaints and, with one or two exceptions, declined to take action against Fox. In the case of "And the Wiener Is," the FCC actually issued a formal decision explaining its non-action, noting that while the episode used the word penis and various euphemisms for it repeatedly, the absence of graphic visual depiction and the absence of what the FCC characterized as a shocking, pandering, or titillating effect meant the episode did not cross the legal threshold for indecency. The episode that generated the most formal complaints in the show's history was Family Gay, which premiered on the 8th of March 2009. The episode, built around the premise that Peter temporarily becomes gay after receiving an injection during a medical experiment, generated 368 FCC complaints following its initial airing. This staggering number was almost entirely a product of the PTC's organized campaign. The organization had encouraged its members to file individual complaints, and they had done so with remarkable efficiency. The PTC president Tim Winter described the episode as containing content including an 11-way gay orgy and babies eating sperm, and characterized it as a flagrant violation of broadcast decency standards. The FCC, again, declined to take formal action. The agency apparently determined that the content, however crude, did not meet the legal standard for actionable indecency. Family Guy's creators were not particularly surprised. The show's fifth season episode, PTV, had been a direct satirical response to FCC censorship and PTC-style advocacy groups, featuring Peter creating his own broadcast network after the FCC begins banning everyday human activities. MacFarlane had been playing with and mocking the entire censorship apparatus for years, and the show's institutional confidence in its legal position, rooted in the show's string of successful defenses of its content in civil court, extended to its attitude toward regulatory complaints as well. The PTC did achieve one significant regulatory victory adjacent to Family Guy, though not quite about Family Guy itself. In 2004, in the aftermath of the Janet Jackson Super Bowl halftime wardrobe incident, the FCC dramatically increased its penalties for broadcast indecency, raising the maximum fine per violation from $27,500 to $500,000. This created a more hostile regulatory environment for provocative broadcast content generally. Fox eventually became more cautious about certain things, and there were episodes and moments in later Family Guy seasons where content that might have made it to air in earlier years was apparently toned down in response to the post-Super Bowl regulatory climate. But this was an indirect effect. The PTC never succeeded in getting an FCC fine levied specifically against Family Guy. There is a somewhat unexpected coda to the PTC's years-long war with Family Guy. In 2015, after an episode called Our Idiot Brian contained a double penis joke that the PTC found offensive, the PTC president Tim Winter issued another complaint and expressed another round of criticism. MacFarlane, in an unusual move, responded by offering Winter a chance to either write an episode of Family Guy himself or to designate two writers of his choosing to write an episode. Winter, apparently stunned by the offer, accepted the conversation, and what followed was a period of genuine communication between two parties who had spent the better part of 2 decades at each other's throats. They did not become allies exactly, but they developed something that both parties later described as a grudging mutual respect. Winter acknowledged that MacFarlane was genuinely talented. MacFarlane acknowledged that some of the PTC's concerns about content were not entirely without merit. This reconciliation was in some ways the most surprising development in the entire long war between Family Guy and its critics. Two parties who had defined themselves partly in opposition to each other, the show that prided itself on being the thing the PTC hated most, and the organization that prided itself on opposing the show most loudly, found a way to have an actual conversation. The PTC itself filed for bankruptcy protection in late 2025, having accumulated $285,000 in liabilities against only $92,000 in assets. The organization that had generated 188,000 FCC complaints about a cartoon had run out of money. Family Guy, meanwhile, had been renewed for 4 more seasons in a deal with Disney that would carry it to 2029. Section 9. The Legal Legacy of Parody. What Family Guy Taught Copyright Law. The lawsuits we have examined in the preceding sections are not just interesting stories about a television show and its legal adventures. They are also, taken together, a case study in how American copyright and free speech law actually functions in practice, as opposed to how it is described in textbooks. The Family Guy cases form a cluster of precedent-setting and precedent-applying decisions that copyright lawyers and entertainment law scholars have cited, analyzed, and argued about for years. Understanding what these cases added to the legal landscape helps explain not just why Family Guy survived all of its legal challenges, but why the American legal system almost always protects comedy that borrows from public figures and public domain cultural works. The foundation of all of it, as we have noted, is the Supreme Court's 1994 ruling in Campbell v. Acuff Rose Music, Inc. To understand why that case matters so much, you have to understand what the stakes were. In 1989, the rap group 2 Live Crew released a parody of Roy Orbison's Oh, Pretty Woman, taking the distinctive opening guitar riff and the general melody of the original and building a new song around it that was sexually explicit and deliberately crude. Orbison's publisher, Acuff Rose Music, sued for copyright infringement, arguing that 2 Live Crew had not sought permission, had not paid a license fee, and had produced a commercial parody that was not protected by fair use. The case worked its way up through the federal courts, with the courts below ultimately ruling against 2 Live Crew. The Supreme Court reversed that ruling unanimously in 1994, holding that the commercial nature of a parody does not automatically defeat a fair use defense, and that parody, genuine parody that comments on the original work, is entitled to significant protection, even when it borrows substantially from that original. Justice David Souter's opinion in Campbell laid out the 4-factor test that courts have been applying ever since, and it articulated the principle that parody has a special relationship to its source material that distinguishes it from ordinary infringement. A parody must borrow enough to make the original recognizable, because it is the original being commented upon. Campbell became the controlling precedent for both the Bourne Company case and, indirectly, the Carol Burnett and Art Metrano cases. In the Bourne Company case, Judge Batts cited Campbell explicitly and repeatedly, using its framework to analyze whether I Need a Jew was genuine parody or mere satire. Her decision to find it parody and to analyze the 4 factors in the way she did was squarely within the Campbell tradition. When entertainment law scholars write about Campbell's ongoing influence, the Bourne Company v. 20th Century Fox case is frequently cited as an example of how the parody doctrine functions in the context of animated television comedy. The Carol Burnett ruling added something specific to the right of publicity dimension of this analysis. Judge Pregerson's decision to dismiss Burnett's right of publicity claims alongside her copyright claims was significant because it clarified the reach of California's right of publicity statute in the context of comedic parody. The ruling established that placing a fictional version of a celebrity in an embarrassing context, even a sexually charged, crude, and degrading context, does not constitute the kind of commercial exploitation of a person's identity that the right of publicity is designed to prevent, as long as the placement is part of an artistic or comedic work rather than an advertisement. This has implications well beyond Family Guy, for every television show, film, and internet video that uses celebrity likenesses in parody contexts. The Art Metrano case added yet another layer, because it involved a performance rather than a published song or a fictional character. The question of whether a comedian's live act, their specific physical gestures, their specific choice of backing music, their specific performance style can be protected as a copyright-eligible creative work, is genuinely contested in the law. Metrano's attempt to register his routine with the Copyright Office was rejected, but that rejection did not necessarily mean the routine was unprotectable. The court's refusal to dismiss his case on fair use grounds, combined with the eventual out-of-court settlement, left the legal question somewhat unresolved. Metrano's case could be read as suggesting that sufficiently distinctive performance routines occupy a zone of copyright protection that courts are willing to take seriously, even if the practical obstacles to enforcing that protection are substantial. Together, these 3 cases constitute something like a Family Guy copyright primer, an involuntary but instructive tour through the different ways creative work can be protected, the different ways those protections can be invoked, and the different results those invocations can produce. The show lost none of the civil lawsuits against it in the conventional sense. Burnett and Bourne Company both had their cases dismissed, and Metrano settled for undisclosed but apparently satisfactory terms. But the legal landscape mapped out by these cases is not a simple story of an invincible show that can do whatever it wants without consequences. It is a more nuanced story about where the law draws its lines, and why those lines are drawn where they are. The parody doctrine that protected Family Guy in the Bourne Company case is grounded in a deep philosophical commitment to allowing culture to comment on itself, to allowing one generation's creative work to be taken up, transformed, and redeployed by the next generation. This is not just about comedy. It is about how culture actually works, how meaning gets made and remade, How a song from a 1940 Disney film becomes a vehicle for commentary about anti-Semitism and ethnic stereotyping when placed in a different context by a different artist with a different purpose. The law recognizes this process as valuable, worth protecting even at the cost of allowing crude and offensive uses of beloved materials. The right of publicity doctrine that operated in the Burnett case is grounded in a different commitment to allowing people to maintain some control over their own identities to prevent their faces and names and characters from being appropriated for others' commercial benefit. But that doctrine yields to the First Amendment when what is at stake is genuine artistic commentary, because the alternative, allowing celebrities to veto any depiction they find objectionable, would effectively chill artistic expression in ways that the First Amendment will not permit. The tension between these two commitments is not a flaw in American law. It is a feature. The law is trying to hold two genuine values in productive tension: the creator's right to protect what they made and the culture's right to use what it knows. Family Guy's legal history is, in a strange way, a stress test of that tension, a series of cases that pushed the boundaries of both rights and helped clarify where the edges actually lie. Understanding those edges does not make Family Guy's crude uses of real people's creative work more tasteful. Judge Pregerson was right that it takes more creative talent to create a character like the Charwoman than to put her in a pornography store. But the law was also right that protecting the right to do the latter is the price of protecting the right to do the former, and in a free society, that price is, on balance, worth paying. Section 10. All the celebrities who almost sued and why they didn't. For every celebrity who actually sued Family Guy, there were dozens who were parodied, mocked, depicted in unflattering scenarios, had their voices imitated, had their faces drawn into embarrassing situations, and chose not to pursue legal action. Understanding why they did not sue and what distinguished them from the ones who did tells us as much about the show's legal situation as the lawsuits themselves. The list of public figures who appeared in Family Guy without their permission, or at least without publicly documented permission, is essentially endless. The show's format encouraged celebrity cameos that ranged from gentle to savage, and the cutaway gag structure meant that no real person was ever safe from being dropped into a random comedic scenario at any time. Political figures, film stars, musicians, athletes, television personalities, historical figures, cultural icons, all of them passed through the Family Guy universe with varying degrees of dignity and varying degrees of legal recourse. Seth MacFarlane had a complicated relationship with the celebrities the show lampooned. In some cases, he was friendly with them, and those people would sometimes voice themselves on the show. Rush Limbaugh appeared in multiple Family Guy episodes, voicing himself in segments that depicted him in ways a less secure person might have found objectionable. Limbaugh explained his decision to participate as a choice to branch out from his fanbase, and acknowledged that he found MacFarlane genuinely talented. He told his producers that there was nothing in the scripts he was given that he wanted taken out. He also later, in one of the show's stranger plot developments, physically transformed into an eagle during an episode. Limbaugh was, whatever else you might think of him politically, a good sport about Family Guy's treatment of him, and his willingness to voice himself in the show represented an implicit acceptance of what the show was doing with his image. This was a pattern the show pursued whenever possible, getting celebrities to participate in their own mockery, which was the most effective possible way of diffusing any potential legal action. If you voice yourself in an episode that depicts you in a compromising situation, you have effectively consented to that depiction, and you are unlikely to have a viable legal claim afterward. MacFarlane and the show's producers were skilled at identifying celebrities who were sufficiently confident in their own personas, or sufficiently aware that refusing would look worse than participating to say yes. But many celebrities had no such advance notice. They simply turned on their televisions and found themselves in Family Guy, often in situations they would not have chosen. Jon Stewart, who never appeared on Family Guy as himself, apparently had a different kind of interaction with the show. Seth MacFarlane has mentioned in interviews that Stewart called him after a specific episode and expressed his displeasure in what MacFarlane described as an hour-long angry phone call. MacFarlane did not identify the specific episode, but indicated it involved the 2007 to 2008 writer's strike in some way. Stewart did not sue. He made a phone call. The phone call was apparently very long and very pointed. No lawyers were involved, apparently, and the matter was resolved, or at least left unresolved, between two people who respected each other's work, even when they disagreed about how it handled specific situations. This kind of private communication, the angry call, the strongly worded message, the agent-to-agent conversation was probably the most common form of celebrity response to Family Guy's handling of their likeness. Most celebrities lack sufficient legal grounds to sue because the bar for establishing that a parody has caused legally actionable harm is high, and most parodies do not cross it. But celebrities are also human beings with feelings and reputations and relationships with audiences, and being mocked on national television by an animated show with millions of viewers is something many of them did feel strongly enough about to pick up the phone. The question of why Carol Burnett sued when others did not comes back, at least in part, to the specific nature of what was taken. The charwoman was not just a reference to Burnett's work, it was a specific copyrighted character, a creative work that Burnett owned, not just her likeness or her general persona. The theme song was similarly protected intellectual property. And the ear tug was connected to something personal and emotional that went beyond ordinary celebrity mockery. Burnett's case was one of the rare situations where a celebrity's legal grievance was genuinely strong enough to warrant taking it to court, even if it ultimately was not strong enough to win. Most celebrities whose treatment by Family Guy was offensive but not legally actionable chose to let it go, sometimes publicly and sometimes quietly. There are documented cases of people who heard about what Family Guy had done with their image and laughed it off, treating it as a strange kind of cultural honor, proof that they were famous enough to be worth mocking. There are also documented cases of people who were quietly furious and who made their feelings known through channels other than courtrooms. And there are cases we will never know about, private grievances that never became public. What is interesting about the celebrity ecosystem around Family Guy is how much it reveals about the show's social position in the broader entertainment culture. By the mid-2000s, Family Guy had become powerful enough that being mocked by it was a mark of cultural significance. Being sued was an even larger mark of cultural significance. The celebrities who sued were the ones who decided that the mark the show had made on their legacy was one they were not willing to accept, that the version of themselves deployed in the show was damaging enough, personally or legally, to justify the cost and exposure of going to court. Most decided it was not worth it. A few decided it was. And the ones who decided it was built the body of law that shapes how American courts think about celebrity parody to this day. There are a handful of near-miss situations that are worth examining in some detail, because they illuminate the show's approach to the line between what it could do and what it was willing to do. The show's treatment of various living politicians was chronically aggressive. Family Guy depicted sitting presidents in unflattering terms, made sexual jokes about political figures' personal lives, and put real people into fictional scenarios that would be obviously defamatory if stated as fact. The reason none of these ever resulted in lawsuits is a combination of the parody doctrine and a specific principle in American defamation law. A statement cannot be defamatory if no reasonable person would take it as a statement of fact. When a cartoon dog looks at a cartoon caricature of a real politician and makes a crude joke about their private life, no reasonable viewer believes this is a factual claim about the politician's actual behavior. The absurdity of the context and animated show about a talking dog provides a kind of built-in protection. This protection does not extend to all media. If a serious news broadcast made the same claims, even in a comedic format, the analysis would be very different. But Family Guy's visual identity as an animated comedy gave its most outrageous statements about real people a layer of legal insulation that would not exist if the same statements appeared in, say, a newspaper or a documentary. The celebrities who survived Family Guy's treatment with their dignity intact, and there were many of them, generally did so by either participating in the show themselves, publicly laughing off the mockery, or simply ignoring it. The ones who sued were the outliers, the exceptions to the general rule that being mocked by Family Guy was simply the cost of being famous enough to be noticed. Section 11. Venezuela bans the show International Fallout and the real-world consequences of Family Guy's provocations. Not all of Family Guy's legal and regulatory trouble has been domestic. The show's reach extended to international markets, where it encountered a very different set of expectations about what comedy is allowed to say, and where the legal and regulatory frameworks that protect American parody simply do not apply. The most dramatic international incident in Family Guy's history occurred in 2009, when the Venezuelan government took action in response to a specific episode, Season 7's 420, which aired in April 2009. The episode featured Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the town of Quahog, Rhode Island, and it included content that the Venezuelan government found deeply offensive. Venezuela's justice minister at the time issued a public statement condemning the episode as an example of the United States of America using entertainment media to promote drug use among young people. Cable television stations in Venezuela were explicitly warned that they would face fines if they continued to air Family Guy. The episode was effectively banned in Venezuela. This was not a lawsuit in the American legal sense. It was a regulatory action by a national government using its authority over broadcast licenses to prevent content it deemed harmful from reaching its citizens. But it was legal action of a kind, and it had real consequences for the show's ability to air in a significant international market. The Venezuelan incident was unusual in scale, but not entirely unique in character. Family Guy's provocative content had generated complaints and occasional regulatory responses in a number of other countries where the show was broadcast. The show's treatment of religious figures, including Jesus Christ, the Prophet Muhammad in at least one attempted episode that Fox ultimately did not air, and religious institutions generally was a source of ongoing tension in various international broadcast markets, where legal and cultural protections for religious expression were very different from those in the United States. The United Kingdom, which was one of Family Guy's largest international markets, had its own broadcast regulator, Ofcom, that operated under rules quite different from the FCC's. British broadcast regulations distinguished between pre-watershed content before 9 p.m. and post-watershed content, and the standards for each were significantly different. Family Guy aired in the UK after the watershed, which gave it considerably more latitude than it would have had in an earlier time slot, and Ofcom received complaints about Family Guy but generally did not take regulatory action against it for most of its run. What these international situations illuminate is the degree to which Family Guy's legal victories in American courts were a product of specifically American legal culture. The First Amendment is not a universal document. The parody doctrine, rooted in American copyright law and American free speech traditions, does not automatically apply in other jurisdictions. The same content that courts in the United States repeatedly found to be protected parody might well have crossed legal or regulatory lines in other countries. This is an important dimension of the show's international existence that its domestic legal history does not capture. When Family Guy won its American lawsuits, it won them on grounds that were specific to American law. Those victories did not translate into immunity everywhere the show aired. The Venezuelan ban was a reminder that the show existed in a global media environment where the American legal framework was just one of many frameworks, and where not every framework was as accommodating of aggressive comedy. The show continued to air internationally throughout this period, reaching audiences in dozens of countries with widely varying attitudes toward the kind of content Family Guy was producing. In many of those countries, the show was modified for local broadcast. Certain jokes were cut, certain images were altered, certain cultural references were replaced. The version of Family Guy that aired in international markets was often substantially different from the version that aired on Fox in the United States, a reflection of the show's production team making calculated decisions about which provocations were worth preserving and which were not worth the regulatory complications they would generate. Family Guy had been banned from Venezuelan cable. It had been censored or modified in multiple markets. It had generated regulatory complaints in several European countries, but it continued to expand its international reach, and its episodes continued to circulate globally on streaming platforms and through other distribution channels that were considerably harder for national governments to regulate. The international story of Family Guy is, in a sense, the American legal victories multiplied and complicated by every other country's different relationship to comedy, provocation, and free expression. Section 12. When the show turns on itself, the Metrano lawsuit's deeper implications. Before we close out the formal legal narratives, there is a dimension of the Art Metrano lawsuit that deserves its own sustained attention because it touches on something that the other lawsuits do not quite reach. Metrano's case was not just about a performance being used without permission. It was about the way comedy itself works, the way jokes build on other jokes, the way comedians borrow from each other, the way a bit that makes Johnny Carson fall off his chair in 1970 can somehow end up in the body of Jesus Christ in a 2005 animated DVD. Art Metrano's career was built on a very specific kind of comedy, the comedy of the fake expert, the person who performs with enormous confidence and conviction while doing something that is obviously not impressive. The amazing Metrano act worked because the audience could see clearly that nothing magical was happening, and yet Metrano performed as if he had just accomplished something remarkable. The humor was the gap between the performance's claims and its actual content. It was meta-comedy comedy about the conventions of comedy, specifically about the convention of the magic act and the performer's relationship with the audience. That same structure, confident performance, obvious gap between claim and reality, is at the heart of a great deal of Family Guy's comedy. The show regularly deploys it. Peter behaving with enormous conviction about something he is obviously wrong about. Stewie performing with villainous certainty about plans that clearly will not work. Brian presenting himself as intellectually sophisticated while being, in many episodes, anything but. The comedic DNA of the amazing Metrano act and the comedic DNA of Family Guy's signature jokes share common ancestors. When Family Guy used the amazing Metrano routine to make a joke about Jesus, it was doing something that comedians have always done, borrowing a recognizable bit from the shared pool of cultural comedy, plugging it into a new context, and generating a new joke from the collision between the borrowed material and its new setting. This is not exactly stealing. It is a form of cultural inheritance, the way comedy has always worked, through allusion and quotation and parody and the constant recycling of bits across generations of performers. The legal question Metrano's lawsuit raised was whether that inheritance has any limits. Whether there is a point at which borrowing a specific enough combination of gesture and song and style constitutes copyright infringement, even when the borrowing is done in the service of a new joke that points in a completely different direction. The court declined to dismiss the case on that question, which is significant. It means a federal judge looked at the specific and distinctive quality of Metrano's act and declined to say that no possible copyright protection could exist. The settlement that eventually resolved the case left the question unanswered in legal terms. We do not know what a trial would have produced. We know that Art Metrano received what he called a very nice settlement. We know that Fox paid something. We do not know what either party's lawyers actually believed about the underlying merits. Legal settlements often happen not because one side is certain to win, but because both sides have reasons to avoid the uncertainty of a trial. What we can say is that Metrano's lawsuit pointed toward a dimension of copyright law, that the Burnett and Bourne Company cases did not reach the protection of performance, of physical comedy, of the specific and distinctive ways that comedians inhabit their acts. That dimension of copyright law is genuinely unsettled in the United States, and the Family Guy cases did not settle it. They just added one more data point to a complex and evolving picture. Metrano's death in September 2021 closed the personal dimension of that story. But the legal question he raised, can you copyright a comedy act? Can you own a specific way of making your fingers jump while humming a particular tune? Continues to be relevant in an entertainment landscape where performance styles, catchphrases, physical bits, and comedic structures are borrowed and adapted constantly, often without credit, often without compensation, and occasionally without legal challenge. The amazing Metrano made Johnny Carson laugh until he fell. It made for a brief moment Jesus Christ look like a comedian on a cable TV DVD. And it prompted a federal court to spend 2 years considering whether the distinctive combination of humming and fake magic that defined a Brooklyn comedian's career was something the law was willing to protect. Section 13. The defenses that always worked, why Family Guy kept winning. Having walked through every significant legal challenge the show faced, it is worth stepping back and asking a broader question. Why did Family Guy win so consistently? The show was sued repeatedly by parties with genuine grievances and with real legal arguments. It faced regulatory action from organized advocacy groups. It generated hundreds of thousands of formal government complaints. And yet, in every civil lawsuit brought against it, the show emerged either victorious or, at worst, settled on undisclosed terms that did not require it to change its content or acknowledge wrongdoing in any formal way. The answer has several layers, and they are worth examining because they illuminate not just Family Guy's specific legal situation, but the broader structural protections that American law extends to comedy, satire, and entertainment. The first and most fundamental layer is the First Amendment. The United States Constitution's guarantee of free speech is unusually broad by international standards, and American courts have consistently interpreted it to protect even deeply offensive expression in most circumstances. The concept of prior restraint using legal action to prevent speech before it occurs is particularly disfavored under American First Amendment doctrine. And the concept of using legal action to punish speech after the fact faces significant hurdles when the speech in question is artistic or comedic expression, because courts apply a strong presumption in favor of protecting expression in those categories. Family Guy benefited enormously from this presumption. Every time it went to court, it was defending expression that most people, even people who found that expression distasteful, would recognize as falling within the broad category of comedic commentary on public figures and public culture. Even Judge Pregerson, who was quite explicit about finding the charwoman scene offensive and crude, was clear that his personal distaste was irrelevant to the First Amendment analysis. The question was not whether the joke was good. The question was whether it was protected. And under American constitutional doctrine, crude and offensive jokes about public figures are protected speech, almost categorically. The second layer is the specific structure of the fair use doctrine and the parody defense in copyright law. Family Guy's creative approach, taking recognizable elements of existing culture, a famous song, a beloved character, a well-known performance, and deploying them in parodic contexts, aligned almost perfectly with the category of creative use that the Campbell v. Acuff-Rose ruling had identified as deserving of protection. The show was not copying for commercial gain with no transformation. It was specifically using recognizable elements to make jokes that commented on those elements or placed them in new contexts. That is what the parody doctrine was designed to protect. The third layer is the nature of the show itself, its identity as an animated comedy. American courts and regulatory bodies have consistently given animated comedy shows considerable latitude, partly because the visual form signals a distance from reality that protects individual segments from being read as factual claims, and partly because animation has traditionally been understood as a medium in which exaggeration and absurdity are conventions rather than distortions. When a cartoon does something outrageous, it is harder to argue that viewers are being deceived or that reputations are being factually damaged in the way they might be if the same content appeared in a more realistic format. The fourth layer is Fox's legal resources. 20th Century Fox is a major entertainment corporation with experienced intellectual property lawyers and substantial financial resources to dedicate to litigation. When Family Guy was sued, Fox did not just have the better legal argument. In most cases, it had the infrastructure to make that argument effectively, to file the right motions at the right times, to appeal unfavorable rulings, and to project a posture of confidence that influenced how opposing counsel and courts perceived the cases. A smaller production company facing the same lawsuits might not have been able to defend them as successfully, even if the underlying legal merits were identical. The fifth and perhaps least commented upon layer is the strategic coherence of the show's creative choices. Family Guy was provocative in specific ways. It targeted cultural icons, religious figures, celebrities, political figures, but it was generally careful, whether consciously or through instinct, to deploy its provocations in ways that had some claim to being genuine parody. The charwoman in the pornography store was crude, but it had a discernible structure as parody. I Need a Jew was offensive, but it was structured as a parody of a specific song for specific comedic reasons. The Jesus metronome routine was shocking, but it was embedded in a larger comedic argument about the nature of miracles. None of these were random uses of copyrighted material. They were purposeful deployments of recognizable cultural references in service of comedic points, and that purpose-driven quality gave them their legal protection. These 5 layers working together created a show that was remarkably lawsuit-resistant for something that sued so much trouble. Family Guy was not untouchable. The Metrano settlement suggests that under the right circumstances, with the right facts, a plaintiff could extract real money from Fox. But the show emerged from more than 2 decades of legal challenges with its creative license essentially intact, having made no significant changes to its approach in response to any of the lawsuits it faced. That is an unusual achievement for a show as consistently provocative as Family Guy. It reflects both the strength of the legal framework protecting it and the strategic intelligence with which the show navigated that framework. Whether deliberately or through the accumulated luck of a creative team that understood, even if only instinctively, what the law would and would not protect. Section 14. The show that survived everything, Family Guy's renewal deals and the business of being controversial. By April 2025, Family Guy had been renewed for 4 more seasons in what industry reporters called a mega deal with its parent company Disney, which had acquired Fox's entertainment assets in 2019. The renewal would carry the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season in the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The show that had been sued multiple times, that had generated hundreds of thousands of FCC complaints, that had been banned in Venezuela and censored in multiple international markets, that had averaged only 723,000 viewers in its 23rd season, a fraction of a percent of the audience that watched its original premiere in 1999, was being guaranteed additional years of production by one of the largest entertainment companies in the world. The reason for this apparent disconnect between the show's shrinking audience and its continued production deals is the same reason that has driven almost every other decision in Family Guy's long institutional life. Money. Not the money from first-run network broadcasts, where the ratings tell a story of significant decline, but the money from what the entertainment industry calls the back-end reruns, streaming rights, merchandise, international licensing, and the accumulated brand value of a show that has been running for more than a quarter century. Family Guy airs in reruns on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable networks. It streams on Hulu, where it remains one of the platform's consistently watched library titles. It generates merchandise revenue from clothing, toys, video games, and other products. It has licensed its brand for theme park attractions, live events, and a range of other commercial applications. When Disney looks at Family Guy, it does not just see a show with declining ratings on Wednesday nights. It sees a franchise with substantial ongoing commercial value, a recognizable brand that continues to generate revenue across multiple revenue streams without requiring the kind of investment that a new show would demand. The animated shows are significantly cheaper to produce than live-action programming. There are no expensive sets to build, no large on-camera cast salaries to negotiate beyond the voice actors, no location shoots, no costume departments. The production infrastructure for an animated series is leaner and more predictable than almost any other type of television programming. This means that a show like Family Guy can remain commercially viable at audience levels that would make a live-action show with similar production costs economically unsustainable. MacFarlane himself has acknowledged this dynamic with a candor that is somewhat unusual for a television creator discussing his own show. In an interview in April 2024, he framed the show's continued existence in terms of financial utility and audience demand rather than creative passion. He said there was a time when he had thought it might be time to wind things down, but that the show had reached a point of what he called escape velocity. It had been running long enough that there was no logical reason to stop unless the audience stopped caring. He noted that the show helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. There was no mention of exciting new creative directions he was eager to explore. The show was continuing because it could, and because it was still commercially viable, and because its continued production served purposes beyond the show itself. This is a very different energy from the Seth MacFarlane, who pitched a 15-minute animated pilot to Fox in May 1998 with something to say and people he was excited to bring to life and stories he was hungry to tell. That MacFarlane had creative urgency. The show now continues because it has become something larger than its original creative impulse. A brand, a franchise, a cultural institution with its own momentum, its own commercial logic, and its own set of institutional relationships that do not depend on any individual's creative passion for their justification. The lawsuits we have examined throughout this piece are, in a strange way, part of this story. They are part of the story of a show that became so culturally significant that people were willing to spend years in federal court arguing about it. Carol Burnett cared enough about the charwoman to sue. Bourne Company cared enough about When You Wish Upon a Star to sue. Art Metrano cared enough about The Amazing Metrano to sue. The Parents Television Council cared enough about the show's content to generate hundreds of thousands of formal government complaints and file repeated FCC petitions. All of that legal and regulatory energy was directed at Family Guy because Family Guy was significant enough to be worth directing it at. A show nobody cared about would never have been sued. A show nobody watched would never have generated 188,000 FCC complaints. The lawsuits, as strange as it sounds, are a kind of tribute to the show's cultural weight evidence that the cartoon from Rhode Island mattered enough, reached enough people, embedded itself deeply enough in American cultural consciousness that the people it provoked were willing to do something about it beyond simply changing the channel. Section 15. The Anatomy of a Legal Threat, How a Cartoon Gets Sued and What Happens Next. For anyone who watches Family Guy and wonders, somewhere in the back of their mind, how any of this is legally possible, how a major network show can put a beloved comedian's signature character in a pornography store, or make a song that deliberately imitates a Disney classic while pairing it with stereotyped lyrics, or replicate a comedian's entire act in the body of Jesus Christ, it is worth understanding the practical mechanics of how these situations developed from moment to broadcast to courthouse. The production process for a Family Guy episode, particularly in the early and middle seasons when these lawsuits were accumulating, was roughly as follows. Writers would pitch ideas in the room, develop stories, write scripts. The cutaway gags, those short, standalone jokes, were often written separately and somewhat interchangeably, generated in abundance and distributed through episodes as needed. MacFarlane and the showrunners would review material and make creative decisions. The scripts would go into production voice recording, then animation overseas, then post-production. Somewhere in that process, someone would have decided that putting Carol Burnett's charwoman in a pornography store would be funny. Someone would have decided that Peter singing a parody of When You Wish Upon a Star about needing Jewish financial help would be funny. Someone would have decided that having Jesus do the Amazing Metrano routine would be funny. These decisions were made by people who almost certainly knew they were working with recognizable cultural material. The show was entirely built on working with recognizable cultural material. It was the premise, not an accident. What the show apparently did not consistently do was seek permission for all of these uses. In the Bourne Company case, we know explicitly that the producers did seek permission and were refused, and then made the song anyway. In the Burnett case, Fox apparently made no attempt to seek permission, simply proceeding on the assumption that using a public figure's image in a parody context was protected without requiring prior approval, which, as the court confirmed, was legally correct. In the Metrano case, it seems clear that no one made contact with Metrano before using his act in the Stewie Griffin DVD. The lack of a systematic permission-seeking process for these kinds of uses is not unusual in the entertainment industry. For clearly commercial uses, playing a song on the soundtrack, using a photograph in a promotional context, rights clearances are standard and well understood. But for parody and satirical uses that the show's producers believed were protected by fair use, the usual approach was simply to make the content and deal with any objections if and when they arose. This is a risk management calculation. If you believe you are legally protected, the cost of seeking permission is mostly friction, because rights holders will often refuse permission for content they find offensive, regardless of whether their refusal is legally enforceable. When disputes did arise, the typical sequence was a notice or complaint to Fox, a response from Fox's legal team asserting the fair use defense, a period of negotiation or formal legal filing, and then either a dismissal or a settlement. The cases that became public lawsuits were the ones where negotiation failed and a party decided to file formal legal action. Many potential disputes were presumably resolved at the pre-lawsuit stage, with some combination of Fox's legal team convincing the aggrieved party that they lacked a viable claim, or agreeing to some minor accommodation, or simply sitting out any anger until it dissipated. The pattern of legal challenges Family Guy faced suggests that the show's approach to cultural borrowing, while legally successful, was not universally accepted or universally welcomed. The people who sued did so because they felt that something had been taken from them, something they had built, something they valued, something they felt deserved more respect than a throwaway joke. The fact that the law ultimately sided with Family Guy in most cases does not mean those feelings were wrong. It means the law, in weighing those feelings against the value of free comedic expression, came down on the side of the expression. That is the American legal tradition in action. It does not always feel good to the people on the losing end of it. Carol Burnett's Charwoman is still in the pornography store, in every streaming version and every DVD of Peterotica. The show never edited it. The court never ordered them to. The episode exists in the permanent archive of American television comedy, a case study in where the law draws its lines and what falls on which side. Section 16. The Final Accounting. What these lawsuits mean for how we think about comedy and law. We have now walked through the full landscape of Family Guy's legal history with real people and real organizations, the lawsuits brought by Carol Burnett, by the Bourne Company, by Art Metrano, by MacFarlane and his writers against Fox, and the regulatory campaigns mounted by the Parents Television Council. We have explored the legal reasoning behind the outcomes, the human stories behind the plaintiffs, the broader frameworks of American law that shaped how these disputes were resolved. What does it all add up to? One thing it adds up to is a very clear picture of what comedy is protected from in the United States. If you are a performer, you can be mocked, parodied, and depicted in embarrassing fictional scenarios, and the law will not help you unless you can show that the depiction constituted deliberate, malicious defamation rather than obvious comedic exaggeration. If you are a copyright holder, you can protect your work from commercial copying, but you cannot protect it from parody from being used as the raw material for jokes that comment on what you made. If you are a person whose personal gesture, whose private tradition, whose most cherished creation is borrowed for a crude joke, you can file a lawsuit, but you are likely to lose if what was done to your creation falls within the broad definition of parody and transformative use. These are not comfortable conclusions for everyone. They are the conclusions that American law has reached after decades of wrestling with the tension between protecting creative work and protecting free expression, and they reflect a consistent judgment that free expression, in the context of comedy and satire, takes precedence in almost every situation that does not involve direct commercial appropriation or deliberate factual defamation. What these cases also add up to is a collection of human stories that are worth remembering. Carol Burnett, who built one of the great characters in television history from an image she heard on a radio program, who tugged her ear every night for 11 years to say goodnight to her grandmother, who went to federal court to try to protect what she had made and what it meant to her. Art Metrano, who made Johnny Carson fall off his chair, who fell off a ladder and broke his spine and turned his recovery into a comedy show that raised money for disabled people, who settled a lawsuit over Jesus performing his act for what he described as very nice terms. The Bourne Company, fighting for a song from a Disney film that had become something larger than a Disney film, a symbol of innocent aspiration, of the promise that dreams come true, of the way music can carry meaning across generations. And Seth MacFarlane and 15 of his writers, suing the network that aired their show for 12 minutes of footage they believed they were owed. That lawsuit, the most easily forgotten of all of these, is in some ways the most important for understanding what Family Guy actually was, not just a cultural phenomenon, not just a legal liability, but a workplace, a creative enterprise, a place where people wrote for a living and needed to be paid fairly for their work. Family Guy is still going. The lawsuits are mostly history. Art Metrano is gone. The Parents Television Council has filed for bankruptcy. Carol Burnett is in her 90s and is, by any measure, one of the greatest living figures in American entertainment history, with a legacy that no animated pornography store joke could genuinely touch. The Bourne Company presumably still holds the copyright to When You Wish Upon a Star, which continues to be one of the most beloved songs in the American canon. And I Need a Jew, The Amazing Metrano Jesus, and The Charwoman with Her Mop are all still out there in the archived episodes, still available to stream, still capable of making people laugh or cringe or both simultaneously. They exist in the permanent record of a show that pushed as hard as any show in television history against the limits of what comedy is allowed to borrow and borrow and borrow from the culture around it. The law said the borrowing was allowed. It said so, repeatedly. in federal courtrooms, in rulings that quoted the Supreme Court and the First Amendment and the deep American tradition of protecting speech that offends. The law was right on its own terms, and the people who tried to say the borrowing had gone too far were also right on their own terms. Both things can be true. Quite often in life, they are. Section 17. The strange afterlives where all the parties are now. It has been a long journey through courtrooms and cartoon studios and the legal architecture of American comedy, and as we come to the close of this story, it seems fitting to spend a moment with where all the principals ended up. In the years after the legal battles settled into history, Carol Burnett went on to continue her extraordinary career well past the Family Guy lawsuit, adding awards and honors to a collection that already included 7 Golden Globes and 7 Primetime Emmy Awards. In 2013, she received the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor from the Kennedy Center, joining a list of recipients that includes Richard Pryor, Bob Newhart, Tina Fey, and others. In 2015, she received the Screen Actors Guild Life Achievement Award. She continued making television appearances, voice acting in animated films, including Pixar's Finding Dory, and remained a beloved presence in American cultural life. If the Family Guy lawsuit left a scar, she has not let it show publicly. She has remained throughout everything, exactly what she always was: a comedian of enormous warmth and skill, someone whose work touched millions of people in ways that a brief, crude parody genuinely could not reach. Art Metrano died on the 8th of September, 2021, at 84 years old, at his home in Aventura, Florida, of natural causes. His son Harry announced the death publicly and spoke to reporters about his father's life and legacy. In the words that Harry chose to share, that his father was at the peak of his career when the latter accident happened, and that the career simply stopped, but that he managed to enjoy life and overcome adversity, there is a portrait of a person who found a way to live well, despite circumstances that would have defeated many. The amazing Metrano act, the humming, the fake fingers jumping from hand to hand, the Johnny Carson moment, these things live in the historical record, in clips that have circulated online for decades, in the memories of people who watched The Tonight Show in the early 1970s and laughed until they hurt. Walter Murphy, the composer who wrote I Need a Jew, and who was named as a defendant in the Bourne Company lawsuit, continued his long association with Family Guy, composing music for the show across multiple seasons. He and MacFarlane had a productive creative relationship that predated the lawsuit and outlasted it. The Bourne Company remains a music publishing firm. Their copyright on When You Wish Upon a Star continues to generate licensing revenue from the countless sincere, positive uses of that melody that occur every year in advertisements, films, television programs, and musical performances. The song's association with innocent aspiration, with wishing and hoping, and the magical possibility that dreams might come true remains intact, apparently uncontaminated by its brief association with a cartoon dog owner looking out his window at the night sky and singing about needing a Jewish accountant. Seth MacFarlane moved on from Family Guy in a creative sense long before the show stopped airing. He made Ted, the comedy film about a talking teddy bear, which earned over $500 million worldwide. He made The Orville, the science fiction television series that began on Fox in 2017 and later moved to Hulu, which reflected a very different side of MacFarlane's sensibility: more earnest, more genuinely interested in ideas, more willing to engage with themes of ethics and philosophy without the protective distance of constant irony. He released multiple albums of big band and jazz standards, revealing himself as a genuine singer with serious technique. He produced the Cosmos sequel, Cosmos, a space-time odyssey, bringing astrophysics to a mass audience. Through all of this, he remained the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. He kept coming back to the recording booth, kept lending his voice to a show he had publicly distanced himself from creatively and institutionally. Family Guy kept getting renewed. Family Guy kept generating revenue. Family Guy kept being there, in its Wednesday night slot, in its Hulu library, in the merchandise stores, and the Adult Swim reruns. The Parents Television Council, which had spent decades making Family Guy its primary enemy and its most reliable fundraising cause, filed for bankruptcy protection in the fall of 2025, unable to sustain itself financially. The organization that had generated 188,000 FCC complaints about a single Family Guy episode could not itself generate enough revenue to pay its debts. It had $92,000 in assets and $285,000 in liabilities. In a strange way, this felt like a kind of historical irony. The watchdog group that had defined itself largely through its opposition to Family Guy outlived by only a few years. The decade in which Family Guy's own ratings had declined from millions to hundreds of thousands. Family Guy itself, meanwhile, had been renewed for 4 additional seasons. The show that began with 22 million viewers in 1999 and was averaging fewer than a million by its 23rd season was being guaranteed years of additional production by Disney in a deal that prioritized franchise value over first-run ratings. The Charwoman was still in the pornography store. I Need a Jew was still on the soundtrack. Jesus Christ was still humming Fine and Dandy on the DVD of Stewie Griffin. The Untold Story. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Section 18. The question that lingers, should comedy be allowed to do any of this? This is the question that sits underneath all the legal analysis, all the case names and rulings and fair use factors and First Amendment precedents. The law has answered it, repeatedly, in favor of Family Guy. The law has said, yes, comedy can do this. Comedy can take the Charwoman and put her in a pornography store. Comedy can take a song about wishing upon a star and use it to sing about ethnic stereotypes. Comedy can take a comedian's signature act and give it to Jesus Christ. Comedy can do all of this because the free speech tradition in the United States has decided that the cost of allowing people to say offensive things is lower than the cost of giving authorities the power to decide what is and is not acceptable speech. But the legal answer and the moral answer are not the same thing, and the distinction is worth sitting with. Carol Burnett spent 11 years making a character that was connected to one of the most intimate gestures of her personal life. The ear tug was for her grandmother. Burnett carried her grandmother through the medium of that gesture into millions of American homes for more than a decade. When Family Guy put the Charwoman in a pornography store and made crude sexual jokes about the ear tug, it reached into that deeply personal tradition and treated it as raw material for a cheap laugh. The law said this was protected. The law might even be right. But the people at Family Guy who made that decision could have asked themselves whether the cheap laugh was worth what it cost Carol Burnett personally, and the answer to that question would not have been found in Campbell v. Kwok. Acuff Rose. Art Metrano had a career that was built largely on one specific act, the humming, fake magic routine that made Johnny Carson fall off his chair. That act was the product of a comedian's creative imagination, the distillation of years of performance experience into a specific and distinctive comedic structure. After the latter accident that left him paralyzed, that act was, in a sense, what survived the thing he had built that existed independently of his body, that he could still invoke, that still made people laugh when they saw a clip of him on The Tonight Show. When Family Guy used that act for a Jesus joke, it was borrowing from a deeply personal creative legacy. The law said this was probably not copyright infringement, or at least not clear-cut copyright infringement. Art Metrano got a settlement. But the question of whether a joke about Jesus's mediocre miracles justified borrowing a disabled comedian's specific creative act without asking his permission is not a legal question. It is an ethical one. Ricky Blitt, the writer who wrote When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, a Jewish writer writing about Jewish stereotypes for a show whose writing room was 70% Jewish, made a creative choice to use the melody of a beloved Disney song because that choice would make the comedy better. It would sharpen the contrast, deepen the parody, make Peter's oblivious request land with more comic force. The law ultimately agreed that this was a legitimate creative choice. But the Bourne Company, which owned that melody, had specifically refused to allow it. They had said no. The show made the song anyway. The law said they were allowed to. But there is something worth pausing on in the image of a rights holder saying, "Please do not use this for this purpose," and being told by a court that their preference is legally irrelevant. None of these ethical complications change the legal outcome. The law was right, on its own terms. The First Amendment protections that Family Guy invoked are genuine and important, not just for this show, but for the entire tradition of American satirical comedy that depends on those protections. If courts had ruled differently, if Burnett had won, if Bourne Company had won, if the parody doctrine had been narrowed to require some minimum standard of taste, the effects would have rippled outward far beyond Family Guy, constraining the ability of all satirical comedy to borrow from the culture it is commenting on. The legal victories mattered, but they did not resolve the ethical tensions. The best comedy makes those tensions productive. It uses the borrowing, the parody, the transgression to say something true or sharp or illuminating about the culture it is engaging with. The worst comedy just takes what it wants because it legally can. Family Guy, across its long and complicated run, did both of those things at different times, in different episodes, with different results. The lawsuits it faced were, in their way, a kind of reckoning. Not the kind of reckoning that changes anything legally. Not the kind that costs the show anything permanent. But a reckoning in the older, more elemental sense, a confrontation between what the show did and people who had been affected by what it did, people who came forward and said, "This mattered to me, and you used it without asking, and I am not willing to simply absorb that." The courts heard those voices. They measured them against the Constitution and the case law and the fair use doctrine. They found them insufficient to override the show's legal protections, and they sent Carol Burnett and Bourne Company and Art Metrano's lawyers home. But the voices were real. The grievances were real. The charwoman really was in the pornography store. The ear tug really was connected to a grandmother who used to watch the show from home. The amazing Metrano really was Art Metrano's life's work. The thing he built before the ladder and the thing he talked about after it. Comedy can do what it needs to do. The law says so, but the people comedy does it to are still people, carrying their own meanings and memories and investments in what they made. And those things do not stop mattering just because a federal judge has ruled on the question. That is the final thought from this long exploration of the lawsuits, the rulings, the settlements, the regulatory campaigns, and the strange intersection of animation and American law. The show survived everything. The law protected it, and the people it trampled on the way were real. Section 19. The Echo Chamber: How Family Guy Shaped the Next Generation of Provocative Comedy. One consequence of Family Guy's success in defending itself legally, which has not been widely discussed in the context of its lawsuits, is the effect those victories had on other creators who were watching the show's legal battles unfold. By winning in court, Family Guy did not just protect its own content, it helped establish the legal template that a generation of animated shows, internet comedy creators, and satirical content makers would follow in the years to come. The Campbell v. Acuff Rose ruling from 1994 was important on its own terms. But the Family Guy cases from the mid-2000s, particularly the Burnett ruling in 2007 and the Bourne Company ruling in 2009, translated that abstract Supreme Court language into specific, concrete applications that creators and their lawyers could point to and say, "This is what parody looks like. This is what transformation means." This is where the line falls between protected satirical use and actionable copyright infringement. YouTube was launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation. The clip culture that developed around YouTube during the late 2000s was built on exactly the kind of borrowing that Family Guy had been doing on television, taking recognizable cultural material, deploying it in new contexts, generating new meaning or humor from the collision. The legal questions that YouTube video makers faced were structurally similar to the questions Family Guy had faced, and the Family Guy case law was part of the framework that courts and lawyers applied when YouTube-era disputes arose. The broader democratization of content creation that happened over the 2010s through YouTube, then podcasting, then streaming, then TikTok and other short-form platforms brought millions of new creators into the legal landscape that Family Guy had helped shape. All of those creators who make parody videos, who do comedic covers of famous songs, who put famous people into fictional comedic scenarios, who build their humor around the recognizable textures of popular culture, they operate in a legal environment that the Family Guy cases helped define. This is a complicated legacy. The Family Guy parody doctrine is genuinely important for protecting free expression. It allows comedy to do what comedy has always done: borrow from the culture, riff on what everyone knows, use the recognizable to say something new. Without those protections, satirical comedy would be dramatically impoverished. The targets of mockery would have a veto over their own criticism. But the legacy also includes the enabling of a vast amount of content that borrows carelessly, that takes without acknowledgement, that treats the creative work of others as a raw material to be used without permission or consideration. Family Guy was sometimes thoughtful about this, it was sometimes not. And the legal precedents it built do not distinguish between the thoughtful and the careless uses, they protect both, which is probably the right call legally, even if it does not always feel right ethically. The next generation of creators who build their work on the Family Guy legal foundation will face the same tensions that Family Guy faced. They will make jokes that borrow from real people's real creative legacies. Some of those people will be offended, some of them will sue. The lawsuits will mostly fail, because the law mostly protects parody and satire and comedic transformation. The people suing will go home having lost, and the comedy will continue, borrowing what it needs, ignoring what it wants, transforming what it takes into something that the original did not know it was, and sometimes could not have imagined. That is the tradition. Family Guy did not invent it. It just inherited it, practiced it with more velocity and less grace than most, and defended it in court with enough success to ensure that the tradition would survive into the next generation intact. Section 20. Closing the show that will not end, and the lawsuits that defined it. Family Guy is going to keep going. The deal is signed. The seasons are ordered. Peter Griffin will keep getting into situations that involve real people and real songs and real cultural artifacts. The lawyers at Fox will keep being ready. The parody doctrine will keep being what it is. And somewhere in the back of someone's mind, while watching a Family Guy cutaway, a real person will occasionally recognize themselves in something they did not authorize and did not expect to see. Some of them will call a lawyer, most will not. The ones who do will almost certainly lose. That is the world Family Guy built, season by season, lawsuit by lawsuit, ruling by ruling. We have traveled a long way together through the legal history of a cartoon. We have sat with the people who sued the legendary comedian who protected her creation, the music publisher who guarded a Disney song, the Brooklyn comedian who built a fake magic act and fell off a ladder and came back and sued over Jesus, and we have understood their grievances in the context of what they were actually fighting for. We have followed the rulings through their legal reasoning, understanding not just what the courts decided, but why, and what those decisions mean for the broader landscape of American free speech and copyright law. We have also, I hope, maintained some appreciation for the complexity of all of it, for the genuine value of parody protection and the genuine cost it imposes on the people whose work gets parodied, for the strength of the First Amendment tradition and the real discomfort it generates for real people in real situations, for the way comedy has always operated at the boundary between what is allowed and what is kind and what is true. The lawsuits are history. The show continues. The charwoman is still in the pornography store. Fine and Dandy still plays when Jesus does his finger tricks. Peter still sings to the night sky about what he needs. And somewhere in a federal courthouse, sitting in the archive of American legal history, are the decisions that said all of this was allowed. The decisions that were right, and that were also, in some ways, the saddest kind of right, the right that does not make anything better for anyone. That just describes the boundaries of what the law will protect, and leaves the ethical work to be done by people without gavels. That is where we leave it. With gratitude for your company through all of these chapters, through all of this history, through the long, careful walk through the lives of the people who tangled with this show, and the laws that governed what happened when they did. Take care of yourselves. Sleep well, and if you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe and leave a like. It matters more than you might think, and it helps this kind of work reach the people who will find it most useful. See you on the other side of the next story. End of script. Section 21. Deeper into the Burnett case, the full history of the charwoman, and what she meant. We touched on the Carol Burnett lawsuit earlier, but the case is rich enough, and the human story behind it is deep enough, that it deserves substantially more attention than a single section can give it. The Burnett lawsuit was, in many ways, the one that defined the public's understanding of Family Guy's relationship to the law. It was the most widely reported. It involved the most beloved and recognizable plaintiff. It generated the most discussion among legal scholars and entertainment journalists. And it raised questions about comedy, ownership, and dignity that do not resolve themselves neatly just because a federal judge dismissed the complaint. To understand why Burnett reacted the way she did, you have to understand not just what the charwoman meant to her, but what the whole context of the Carol Burnett show meant. When Burnett's variety show premiered on CBS in September 1967, it was a genuinely historic event. Burnett was the first woman to host a comedy variety series on American network television. This was not a trivial distinction. The comedy variety format had been dominated by men, by Milton Berle, by Sid Caesar, by Jackie Gleason, by Dean Martin, by the entire tradition of the variety show as a male-fronted entertainment institution. Burnett walked into that space and made it her own, and she did it for 11 consecutive seasons, which is an extraordinary run by any standard. The Carol Burnett Show was not just a popular program, it was a creative achievement. The writing was sharp, the performances were committed, the production values were high, and the ensemble that Burnett built around herself, Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence, Lyle Waggoner, and eventually Tim Conway, was one of the great comedic casts in television history. The show's ability to hold its audience season after season, to win awards consistently, to make characters that became part of the cultural conversation, all of this required sustained creative effort and genuine artistic ambition. Burnett was not just a performer. She was a showrunner, a producer, a creative force who shaped every aspect of what appeared on screen under her name. The charwoman emerged within this context of serious creative work. She was not just a recurring gag. She was a character with depth, a specific physical presence, a specific emotional register, a specific relationship to the world around her. When Burnett played the charwoman, she brought a quality of wistful imagination to the role that transcended simple comedy. The charwoman was someone who did unglamorous work and found in that work a kind of dignity. Her daydreaming, the way she would drift away from the mundane reality of mopping floors into elaborate fantasies, was played with a gentleness and a humanity that made her genuinely moving rather than merely funny. The ear tug that Burnett performed at the end of each episode was, as we have discussed, a personal communication to her grandmother. But it is worth saying more about what that relationship meant and why the gesture carried such weight. Mabel Louise White, Burnett's maternal grandmother, was the person who effectively raised Carol Burnett. Burnett's parents struggled with alcoholism, and while she maintained relationships with both of them throughout her life, it was her grandmother who provided the stable, loving home environment that shaped her character and her sense of what was possible. Mabel took Carol to the movies. She took her seriously as a person. She was, by all accounts, a woman of enormous warmth and determination who saw something in her granddaughter and gave it the space to develop. By the time the Carol Burnett Show was airing, Mabel was elderly and not always well enough to see Burnett in person. The show became the connection the way Burnett could reach across the television airwaves and send her grandmother a personal goodnight signal. When Burnett tugged her ear, she was not just a television star doing a signature move. She was a granddaughter saying, "I love you," to the person who made her who she was. Now consider what Family Guy did with that gesture. The show had one character remark that when Burnett tugged her ear at the end of her show, she was saying goodnight to her mother. Another character responded with a crude sexual joke about what she tugged to say goodnight to her father. The sexual innuendo was deliberate and unambiguous. And the target of that sexual innuendo was not some abstract celebrity gesture. It was the thing Carol Burnett did every week to say goodnight to her grandmother. Family Guy almost certainly did not know that the ear tug was connected to Burnett's grandmother. This is not a defense, exactly, but it is relevant context. The show was making a joke about a celebrity signature move, treating it as raw material for comedy. It did not have access to the full personal meaning of what it was parodying. This is often how parody works. It takes the surface of something, the publicly visible element, and works with that, without necessarily understanding the full emotional and personal depth of what it is touching. But it is also one of the reasons that public figures sometimes experience parody as a deeper violation than the parodist intended. Burnett knew what the ear tug meant. Her grandmother knew what it meant. The millions of people who had watched the show every week over 11 years had their own relationships to that gesture, their own sense of it as something warm and personal and specific to this particular woman on this particular show. When Family Guy turned that gesture into a crude sexual punchline, it was not just making a joke about a celebrity's signature move. It was, unwittingly, making a crude sexual joke about Carol Burnett's relationship with her grandmother. The law could not weigh that. The law had no mechanism for considering the full personal significance of what was being parodied. The law looked at the gesture, found it to be a publicly visible element of a public figure's public performance, noted that it had been used in a parody context that qualified as transformative use, and ruled that Family Guy was protected. All of that was legally correct. But the people who found themselves thinking about Carol Burnett and her grandmother in the aftermath of this case, wondering whether the laugh was worth the cost, wondering whether there was something in the whole transaction that the law's framework simply could not capture, were not being legally unsophisticated. They were being human. They were responding to a dimension of the situation that the fair use doctrine is not designed to address. There is a broader principle here that is worth articulating clearly. The law protects expression, but it does not evaluate the full human cost of expression. It draws lines between what is protected and what is actionable, but within the zone of the protected, it cannot and does not make finer distinctions based on who gets hurt, how much they get hurt, or what the full meaning of what was taken actually was to the people from whom it was taken. These finer distinctions are the responsibility of the people making the creative decisions, not of the courts. The courts will protect you if you stay within the law. Whether you should use that protection in a particular way, for a particular joke, at the expense of a particular person's most personal traditions, that is a question the courts leave entirely to you. Family Guy, in the Burnett case, had the legal right to make that joke. The ethical question of whether it should have is one that the show never publicly addressed. Fox's legal victory was clean and complete. The human dimension of the case was a different matter. Section 22. The Bourne Company Case in Full Pinocchio, Anti-Semitism, and the Philosophy of Parody. The Bourne Company case is the most technically complex of Family Guy's legal battles, and it repays careful attention because the legal reasoning behind Judge Batz's ruling is genuinely sophisticated and genuinely illuminating about how copyright law thinks about the relationship between original works and the comedic commentary that borrows from them. To understand the case fully, you have to start with When You Wish Upon a Star itself, what it is, where it comes from, why it occupies the place in American culture that it does. The song was written by Ned Washington and Lee Harline for the 1940 Walt Disney animated film Pinocchio. It was sung in the film by Jiminy Cricket, the small cricket character who serves as Pinocchio's conscience, at a moment in the film when the toy maker Geppetto is wishing for his carved wooden boy to become a real child. The song won the Academy Award for Best Original Song in 1940. It is, by any measure, one of the most beloved songs in American popular music history, a melody of simple, aching beauty paired with lyrics about dreams and wishes, and the possibility that innocent aspiration might somehow be answered by the universe. The song became so associated with Disney as a brand that it effectively became the company's theme music, the sound of Disney, the shorthand for the particular kind of magical aspiration that Disney films were selling. To hear When You Wish Upon a Star is to hear Disney's whole pitch, that the world is full of magic, that dreams come true, that children's hearts are pure, and their wishes will be answered. The melody carries enormous emotional weight for anyone who grew up watching Disney films, which is to say for virtually everyone who grew up watching American entertainment in the 20th century. Bourne Company, as we have established, owns the American copyright to this song. They are a music publishing company, and the song is a substantial asset in their catalog. They earn licensing revenue every time the song is used commercially in films, in advertisements, in theme park attractions, in the hundreds of other contexts where its combination of beauty and cultural resonance makes it commercially valuable. Their interest in protecting that copyright is economic as well as cultural. Every unauthorized use of the melody potentially competes with or diminishes the value of authorized uses. When Peter Griffin stood at his window in When You Wish Upon a Weinstein and began singing to the night sky, the visual composition of the scene deliberately echoed the Pinocchio imagery Geppetto at his window, wishing for the impossible. McFarlane and the show's director knew exactly what they were doing. They were constructing a scene that would call the Disney original to mind in the most direct possible way, so that when Peter began singing his version of the melody, the audience would feel the full weight of the contrast between the original's innocent aspiration and Peter's crude, stereotyped request. The decision to seek permission from Bourne Company before making the song and then to make it anyway after being refused, reflects the show's confidence in its legal position. The producers were not cavalier about copyright, they were strategic. They believed they were making a genuine parody, that their parody would survive fair use analysis, and that Born Company's refusal to grant a license was not legally enforceable because you cannot withhold permission for a parody. So they proceeded. Born Company's lawyers discovered the clip through YouTube, probably not long after it was posted, which means they were alerted to the situation by exactly the kind of viral clip culture that Family Guy's format was designed to produce. The show had been making cutaway gags designed to be shareable and memorable for years, and the I Need a Jew song was exactly the kind of clip that got passed around short, funny to some people, offensive to others, and built around recognizable cultural material that gave it context and meaning beyond the show itself. The lawsuit Born Company filed was not primarily about stopping Family Guy from airing the episode. It was about establishing that the use was not protected by fair use, which would open the door to damages claims for every time the episode had aired. The request to stop the program's distribution was almost certainly included as a legal strategy more than a practical expectation. Courts are very reluctant to issue prior restraint orders in entertainment contexts, and Born Company's lawyers must have known that. But establishing the principle that the song had been infringed, even if injunctive relief was unlikely, would have been commercially significant. Judge Batz's decision to find I Need a Jew a genuine parody rather than mere satire turned on her analysis of what the song was actually commenting on. Her reasoning, which we have discussed in outline, bears deeper examination. She found not just one target of parody, but three distinct layers. The first was When You Wish Upon a Star itself. Its worldview, its implicit claims about how the universe works, its saccharine suggestion that pure wishing produces results. The second was Walt Disney's personal associations with anti-Semitism, the irony of a song from a Disney film being used to comment on Jewish stereotypes, given Disney's own documented associations. The third was Peter's particular kind of ignorance, his childlike literalism that reduces a race of people to a presumed capability. The multi-layered quality of Batz's parody analysis was important because it demonstrated that I Need a Jew was not a simple theft of a famous melody for the sake of a joke. It was a specific comedic construction that used the melody purposefully, that its parodic character could be reasonably perceived even if different viewers might identify different layers of the parody, and that its use of the original was tied to what the parody was actually saying about the original. This is actually a fairly demanding standard. It requires that the parody do something beyond simply borrowing a recognizable tune. It requires that there be some discernible relationship between what is borrowed and what is being said, that the original's specific qualities be implicated in the comedy being made from it. A random funny song that happened to use the melody of When You Wish Upon a Star for no particular reason connected to that song would not have met this standard. But a song that specifically used that melody's associations with innocent aspiration, with Disney, with a particular American cultural tradition, to make a point about the gap between innocent aspiration and the crude reality of how people actually think about each other, that was parody in the fullest legal sense. This is worth pausing on because it illuminates something important about the best of Family Guy's comedy, as opposed to the laziest. The show, at its worst, used recognizable cultural material simply because it was recognizable, dropping a reference to a famous song or character, because the audience would know it without doing anything particularly interesting with the knowledge. The show, at its best, and I Need a Jew, whatever its other qualities, represents the show at something near its best from a purely comedic architecture standpoint, used recognizable cultural material in ways that made the recognition productive, that made the audience's familiarity with the original a necessary component of the joke's meaning. The joke was not just funnier because you knew When You Wish Upon a Star. It was only complete if you knew it because the meaning of the parody depended on the contrast between the original's emotional register and the replacement lyrics' very different emotional register. The Born Company case, enforcing this analysis into the open in a federal courtroom, produced something genuinely useful. A detailed legal and creative examination of how parody actually works, what makes it genuine rather than merely claimed, and what it adds to the culture beyond simple mockery. Judge Batz's opinion is worth reading in full for anyone interested in the intersection of copyright law and comedy. It is one of the more illuminating pieces of legal writing in the entertainment law canon, not because it breaks new ground, but because it applies established principles with unusual clarity to a genuinely interesting example. The final irony of the Bourne Company case is that Family Guy's producers had tried to do the right thing. They had asked for permission and been refused. The refusal was legally impotent, because as the court eventually confirmed, you cannot refuse permission for a legitimate parody. But the attempt to seek permission suggests that the show's creative team was at least aware that using "When You Wish Upon a Star" without authorization was ethically complicated, even if they believed it was legally protected. The combination of seeking permission and proceeding without it when permission was refused is the behavior of people who wanted to be respectful of the original, but were not willing to let that respect prevent them from making the joke they believed in. That combination of respect and defiance we wanted to ask, we were refused, we made it anyway, is a kind of thumbnail portrait of how creative artists have always operated in relation to the cultural materials they borrow from. Section 23. Art Metrano's full story from Brooklyn to The Tonight Show to a ladder and back again. Art Metrano's story is one of the more remarkable human narratives in the broader Family Guy legal history, and it deserves the kind of full telling that allows its arc to land with the weight it actually has. We covered the basics of Metrano's career and the lawsuit earlier, but the full story contains elements that the condensed version cannot capture. Metrano grew up in Brooklyn in the 1930s and 1940s, in the same borough that produced a remarkable concentration of American comedians. The humor of Brooklyn, born from immigrant experience, from working-class pragmatism, from a tradition of street performance and fast-talking survival, was a specific comedic dialect, and Metrano absorbed it. He developed his performance instincts in the clubs and theaters that characterized New York's mid-century comedy scene, and by the late 1960s, he had built enough of a career to start getting television work. But it was his Tonight Show appearance in 1970 that changed everything. The amazing Metrano routine was, in its way, a perfect piece of comedy, clean, immediate, with a premise that was instantly legible and a payoff that built from that premise with perfect internal logic. The premise: a magician is performing a magic trick. The subversion: the trick is obviously not a trick. The elaboration: the magician is entirely unaware of this, performing with complete confidence and self-satisfaction while the audience can see clearly that nothing magical is happening. The humming: a layer of absurdist commitment that made the whole thing feel like a genuine performance rather than a mere sketch. The reason the routine landed so powerfully, the reason Carson fell off his chair, is that Metrano had found a way to compress an enormous amount of comic idea into a very small performance. You did not need a setup. You did not need exposition. You walked on stage, you started humming, you made your fingers jump, and the joke was already there, fully formed, needing nothing but your confident commitment to it. This is the highest achievement in comedy, the joke that requires no explanation, that generates its own context entirely through the performance itself. After the Tonight Show appearance, Metrano was established as a recognizable comedic presence. He returned to the show multiple times. He appeared on other variety programs. His face and his act became familiar to American television audiences in the early 1970s. He built on this success into a solid character actor career, culminating in the Police Academy films in the mid-1980s, where his ability to play pompous authority figures who are consistently outwitted found a natural home. The latter accident in September 1989 was the kind of catastrophe that ends careers and often lives. Metrano fractured 3 vertebrae in his neck. He was quadriplegic. He faced months of intense rehabilitation with no certainty about what function he would regain. He was at what he described in later interviews as the peak of his career when it happened. The timing was cruel. He had built his professional life to a point of genuine success. And then the accident simply removed him from the stage for a period that threatened to become permanent. What Metrano did with that experience, channeling it into a one-man show, into public speaking, into a fundraising effort for spinal cord injury, support reflects a particular kind of character that is worth recognizing. There is a tradition in American comedy of comedians who mine their own misfortune for material, who convert personal crisis into professional purpose, who find in the darkest experiences of their lives the material for genuine connection with audiences who have faced their own dark experiences. Metronome's accidental comedy was in that tradition. The title itself was a joke. The show about an accident that happened to a comedian was itself accidental, a show born from circumstances he had not planned and could not have anticipated. The show's fundraising dimension, raising more than $75,000 for project support for spinal cord injury, is worth dwelling on because it demonstrates the specific way Metrano thought about his situation. He was not just performing about his injury. He was using his performance to generate resources for other people who had experienced similar or worse injuries. The act of standing from his wheelchair at the end of the show, taking a few steps, demonstrating the recovery that the rest of his performance had circled around, was both personal triumph and communal moment. The audience had been with him through the story of the fall and the recovery, and they witnessed the recovery in physical, real time, every night. When Family Guy's DVD dropped, sometime in 2005, and Metrano or someone close to him saw the scene with Jesus humming Fine and Dandy and doing the finger trick, the specific, distinctive gesture that had been the cornerstone of the amazing Metrano routine, there was presumably a specific quality to the recognition. This was not a vague imitation of a comedy style. This was the precise thing, the particular song, the particular gesture, the particular self-satisfied quality of the performance. It was the amazing Metrano, transposed intact into the body of Jesus Christ. Metrano's decision to sue was both a statement about intellectual property and a statement about something more personal about the claim that a comedian has on the specific thing they built. He was not famous for many things. He was famous for the Police Academy films and for The Amazing Metrano. The Amazing Metrano was his creation, his signature, the thing that made Johnny Carson fall off his chair and gave Metrano his identity as a performer. Having it used without asking, without acknowledgement, without compensation, however, comedically was a violation of something that went beyond copyright. The legal proceedings were drawn out and complicated. The initial settlement that Metrano's lawyers reached with Fox apparently broke down, leading to the refiled lawsuit in 2008. The Copyright Office's rejection of his registration application was a setback. The court's refusal to dismiss the case outright, finding that 3 of the 4 fair use factors worked in Metrano's favor, was a genuine legal development, not a formality. What the court said when it refused to dismiss is worth examining carefully. The judge found that the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the infringed work, and the amount and substantiality of what was taken all weighed in Metrano's favor. Only the 4th factor, economic impact, required more fact-finding before it could be assessed. This means that 3 out of 4 fair use factors were leaning against Fox at the motion to dismiss stage. Fox was not in the comfortable legal position it had occupied in the Burnett and Bourne Company cases. The Amazing Metrano case was genuinely contested, with the legal outcome uncertain enough that both sides apparently found a settlement more attractive than a trial. The settlement's confidential terms meant we will never know exactly what Fox paid, but Metrano's characterization of it as a very, very nice settlement suggests it was meaningful. For a comedian whose career had been largely defined by a single routine, for a man who had spent years fighting his way back from a catastrophic injury, for someone who had given the public decades of genuine entertainment and who saw that specific entertainment echoed without credit in a major commercial production, very, very nice. Seems like both a legal outcome and a personal statement. Not just about the money, though the money mattered. About the acknowledgement. About someone having sat with the legal arguments and concluded that Art Metrano had a point. Section 24. The music publisher's perspective. How rights holders see the parody problem. One angle on the Family Guy lawsuits that has not been fully explored in this account is the perspective of the rights holders who lost, particularly the Bourne Company. Understanding why they sued, why they felt their case had merit, and what the implications of their defeat were for the broader music publishing industry illuminates dimensions of the legal landscape that the winner's perspective tends to obscure. Music publishing companies like the Bourne Company exist to manage and monetize the copyrights in songs that their composers and lyricists created. Their business model depends entirely on the principle that the copyright in a song gives its owner the ability to control who uses it and under what terms. They earn revenue from mechanical licenses when songs are recorded for distribution, from synchronization licenses when songs are used in film and television, from performance licenses when songs are played in public venues, and from a range of other licensing arrangements. Every unauthorized use of a song they own is, from their perspective, either a potential infringement claim or a signal that the copyright's value is being eroded. When You Wish Upon a Star was a particularly significant asset in Born Company's catalog. It was associated with one of the most recognizable and beloved brands in the world, Disney, and it carried the kind of emotional resonance that made it valuable for an enormous range of sincere, commercial uses. Companies paid for the right to use that melody in advertising because the melody's associations with innocent aspiration and childhood magic made it a powerful emotional signal. Films and television programs paid for it because it conjured a specific emotional register that was commercially valuable. The song earned Born Company substantial licensing revenue. When Family Guy used the melody to sing about ethnic stereotypes, the concern from Born Company's perspective was not just about the principle of unauthorized use. It was about what that unauthorized use did to the melody's future commercial value. If When You Wish Upon a Star became associated in the public mind with crude ethnic stereotypes, that association might make it harder to license for sincere, positive purposes in the future. A major corporation wanting to use the melody for a heartwarming advertisement might think twice if they knew that I Need a Jew had made the melody briefly infamous for entirely different associations. This concern was specifically addressed and dismissed by Judge Batts in her ruling. She found that the two songs were so different in tone and message that I Need a Jew could not plausibly compete with or substitute for sincere uses of When You Wish Upon a Star. Anyone who wanted to use the original for its genuine emotional power would not be satisfied with the parody, and anyone who had heard the parody and been offended by it would presumably be able to distinguish between a crude comedy show's version of the melody and the real thing. But the dismissal of this concern as a matter of law does not mean the concern was without basis as a matter of commercial reality. Licensing agreements and the decisions of corporate marketing departments are not governed by fair use analysis. A brand manager deciding whether to use When You Wish Upon a Star in a campaign might well be influenced by the song's recent association with a controversial Family Guy episode, regardless of what a federal judge thought about the legal relationship between the two. The reputational market for songs, as opposed to the legal one, is not bound by the rules of copyright law. More broadly, the Born Company case reflects a genuine tension in the music publishing industry between the legal framework that governs unauthorized use and the business interests that make rights holders want to control how their assets are deployed. Copyright law, as we have seen, carves out a substantial exception for parody. But from the rights holder's perspective, this exception is not a carefully calibrated protection of valuable expression. It is a hole in the legal fence through which other people can use your most valuable assets without paying you, without asking you, and without any obligation to stop. The Born Company's lawyers were not making frivolous arguments. They were making the best available arguments for a position that had genuine legal support. The parody-satire distinction is real. The question of what a given work is actually parodying is genuinely contested, and the outcome of fair use analysis is never guaranteed in advance. The fact that they lost does not mean they were wrong to try. It means that, on the specific facts of this specific case, the court found that Family Guy's use fell on the protected side of the line. Other music publishers watching the Born Company case would have drawn their own conclusions about what it meant for their own situation. Some would have concluded that fighting parody claims was generally futile and not worth the expense. Others would have concluded that the specific reasoning in the Burnett and Born Company cases identified clear criteria for when parody protection applies, and that claims which fell outside those criteria were still worth pursuing. The case became a reference point in a broader, ongoing industry discussion about parody, fair use, and the rights of copyright holders in an era when digital distribution made unauthorized use of copyrighted material much easier and much more visible. This industry context is worth keeping in mind because it shapes what the lawsuits meant beyond their individual outcomes. Every legal dispute produces not just a ruling but a data point that other parties use to calibrate their own behavior and their own willingness to litigate. The Family Guy cases, by consistently finding in favor of the show's parody uses of copyrighted material, sent a signal to the music publishing community and the entertainment industry generally. The parody doctrine in America is robust, the courts will apply it seriously, and rights holders who attempt to use copyright to veto criticism of their work will likely fail. Section 25. The cultural context. What made Family Guy the perfect defendant? Part of why Family Guy won its lawsuits so consistently was the timing of those lawsuits in the broader history of American media and the specific cultural moment in which the show operated. Understanding that cultural context helps explain not just why the courts ruled as they did, but why the plaintiffs chose to sue a cartoon show in the first place when so many other potential defendants were making similar or arguably worse uses of copyrighted material and facing no legal action at all. Family Guy premiered in 1999 and returned from cancellation in 2005, the exact midpoint of a decade that transformed American media culture through the simultaneous rise of internet distribution, digital file sharing, and the first wave of what would later be called social media. YouTube launched in 2005. Facebook became available to the general public in 2006. The fragmentation of American media audiences, the splintering of the monolithic broadcast television audience into hundreds of cable channels, streaming services, and eventually infinite online distribution channels was accelerating rapidly throughout this period. In this environment, Family Guy's cutaway gag format was uniquely suited to the emerging clip culture. Individual gags could be clipped out of episodes and shared independently, reaching audiences who might never watch a full episode of the show. The "I Need a Jew" scene from When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was exactly the kind of clip that spread through early YouTube brief, self-contained, funny to some people, offensive to others, and tied to recognizable cultural material that gave it context and made it shareable. The Charwoman scene from Peterotica was similarly clippable. The Jesus Metrano scene was the kind of clip that traveled on the religious humor circuits of early internet comedy. This viral clip culture meant that the episodes generating legal controversy were reaching audiences far beyond the show's regular viewers. The Bourne Company lawyers who found the "I Need a Jew" clip on YouTube were not Family Guy fans who had caught the episode on first airing. They were rights holders who encountered a clip of their copyrighted material being used in an offensive context through exactly the kind of viral distribution that the internet was making ubiquitous. The show's visibility in early internet culture was, paradoxically, part of what made it a target for legal action. The clips were everywhere, and the rights holders who saw them had both more reason to be offended and more evidence of harm than they would have had if the material existed only in a few broadcast airings. At the same time, the show was operating in a media environment where the boundaries of acceptable content were being contested on multiple fronts. The Janet Jackson Super Bowl incident in 2004 had prompted a wave of regulatory tightening. The Parents Television Council and similar organizations were pursuing aggressive complaint campaigns against multiple broadcast networks. Congress was debating indecency legislation, the cultural wars over content, what could be shown on network television, what could be said, what kinds of comedy were acceptable, were being fought out simultaneously in regulatory hearings, in newsrooms, and in living rooms across the country. Family Guy occupied a specific position in this cultural landscape. It was exactly the kind of show that the culture wars were about. Provocative, boundary-pushing, built around exactly the kinds of humor that offended the people who were filing FCC complaints. But it was also a successful, critically recognized, enormously popular show that had built a devoted following through the same qualities that offended its critics. The tension between those two positions, offensive but popular, crude but creative, legally dubious in some people's view, but legally protected, was the defining tension of the show's cultural existence in the mid-2000s. The celebrities and rights holders who chose to sue Family Guy in this period were not just making individual legal decisions. They were participating in a broader cultural negotiation about what comedy was allowed to do with public figures and copyrighted works. By suing, they were asserting that the existing legal protections were insufficient, that the parody doctrine was too broad, that the First Amendment protection for crude commentary was too absolute, that celebrities and rights holders deserved more control over how their identities and creations were used in an era of mass media and viral distribution. They lost those arguments in court. But the arguments were not trivial, and the court's consistent rejection of them is itself a cultural statement about American values, about the relative weight given to free expression versus the rights of creators and public figures to control their own legacies. Different societies would have come to different conclusions, and indeed have. The Family Guy lawsuits are not just entertainment industry disputes. They are data points in the ongoing global negotiation about where free speech ends and protection of individuals and creators begins. Section 26. The International Dimension. Different laws, different limits. American parody law is unusually protective of comedic expression by international standards. The four-factor fair use test, the broad reading of what constitutes genuine parody, the deep First Amendment tradition that makes courts extremely reluctant to restrict comedic commentary on public figures. These are specifically American legal characteristics that do not translate directly into other legal systems. In the European Union, copyright law is governed by a different framework. The EU's Information Society Directive provides for a limited exception for parody, caricature, and pastiche. But the scope of this exception is narrower than the American fair use doctrine and varies significantly between member states. Several European countries require that parody be genuinely humorous and proportionate standards that American courts explicitly avoid imposing because of their inherent subjectivity. The United Kingdom, while it has historically followed a legal tradition closer to the United States than to continental Europe, has its own approach to copyright exceptions that differs from the American model in important ways. Before the Copyright, Designs and Patents Act of 1988 was amended in 2014 to explicitly include parody as a permitted act, British copyright law was even more restrictive than EU standards on the question of parodying copyrighted works. Canada, Australia, and other common law countries similarly have their own copyright frameworks that provide varying degrees of protection for parody and satirical uses of copyrighted material, generally with more restrictions than the American approach, but with significant differences between jurisdictions. What this means for Family Guy is that the show's legal victories in American courts were geographically specific. The same episodes that were found to be protected parody by American federal judges might have been found to constitute copyright infringement under UK law, under EU law, or under the laws of any number of other jurisdictions where the show was distributed. The show's international distribution was therefore a genuinely complicated legal landscape. A show that had been cleared by American courts might still be potentially infringing in every other country where it aired. In practice, this complexity was managed largely through the contractual arrangements that Fox established with international broadcasters and distributors. Those arrangements typically indemnified foreign broadcasters against legal claims arising from the content of the episodes, placing the legal risk on Fox rather than on local broadcast partners. Fox's legal team was presumably reasonably confident that their American fair use victories gave them a defensible position internationally, or at least that the international risk was manageable. But the Venezuelan government's response to the marijuana episode in 2009 illustrated vividly that some countries were not bound by any contractual arrangements with Fox and were entirely free to respond to content they found offensive through regulatory action that had nothing to do with copyright law. Venezuela's action was based not on copyright at all, but on the country's broadcast regulations and the government's authority to control what aired on local cable networks. It was a reminder that American legal victories, however comprehensive within the American legal system, provide no protection against the regulatory and political decisions of sovereign governments exercising authority over their own broadcast media. The international dimension also played out in subtler ways through the show's modification for different markets. Certain jokes that worked in an American cultural context did not translate internationally and were cut or modified. Certain references to American public figures were replaced with local equivalents in some international versions. The show that aired in, say, German or Japanese broadcast markets was shaped partly by legal and regulatory considerations specific to those markets, partly by cultural translation decisions, and partly by the simple reality that some jokes require their original context to make sense. All of this international complexity is largely invisible to the average Family Guy viewer watching the show on Hulu in the United States. But it is part of the full picture of what it means for a show to exist in the global media landscape. A show made in America, under American legal protections, but distributed worldwide into jurisdictions with very different approaches to the same fundamental questions about parody, free expression, and the rights of the people being parodied. Section 27. What the show could have done differently and why it didn't. With the full sweep of Family Guy's legal history in view, it is worth asking a question that critics of the show have often raised and that the show's defenders have often deflected. Was all of this necessary? Was the crude, unauthorized, legally contested use of real people's creative legacies essential to what Family Guy was trying to do? Or was it a choice that could have been made differently without fundamentally compromising the show's creative identity? This is not primarily a legal question. It is a creative and ethical one. The law, as we have established at length, mostly protected the show. But legal protection and creative necessity are different things. The law says you are allowed to do this. It does not say you must. It does not say there was no other option. It does not assess whether the joke was worth the cost, whether the laugh was worth the lawsuit, whether the creative effect justified the personal violation. The show could have asked Carol Burnett for permission. Fox's lawyers might have advised against it, on the grounds that seeking permission for parody creates the implication that permission is required, which could be used against them in future cases. But a phone call to Burnett's representatives, a genuine conversation about what the show intended to do with the charwoman, might have produced a very different outcome. Burnett might have said no, but she might have said yes with conditions, or yes with credit, or she might have been willing to participate herself in a more direct parody that she had some hand in shaping. The assumption that seeking permission was unnecessary because the use was legally protected was probably accurate, but it was also a choice to do the thing without asking, to use the legal protection as a substitute for the ethical consideration. The show could have credited Art Metrano. The DVD could have included a note acknowledging that the Jesus scene referenced and was inspired by the amazing Metrano routine. This would not have resolved the copyright question automatically, but it would have been a mark of respect for the comedian whose specific act was being used, and it would have given Metrano's work visibility with a new generation of viewers who might not have known who he was. Comedy has a long tradition of crediting its influences of comedians acknowledging the shoulders they are standing on. Family Guy, which had no such tradition, treated every cultural artifact it borrowed from as anonymous raw material, available for use without acknowledgement. The show could have engaged more carefully with the distinction between genuine parody and mere appropriation. Not every cutaway that used recognizable cultural material was genuine parody. Some were simply references, borrowings of familiar things without any particular comment on those things, deployed for the recognition value rather than for any parodic purpose. A more careful creative approach might have drawn clearer lines between uses that were genuinely transformative and commentary-bearing, and uses that were simply taking what was recognizable and familiar and deploying it without adding anything new. The reason the show did not do any of these things is the same reason it did so many of the things it did. The show was built on a specific philosophy of creative aggression, a refusal to be constrained by considerations of taste or courtesy when those considerations stood between the writers and a joke they wanted to make. This philosophy had real creative virtues. It produced comedy that was genuinely daring, that went places other shows would not go, that forced conversations about subjects that polite entertainment avoided. But it also had real costs, borne by real people whose work and reputation were used as material without acknowledgement, credit, or genuine respect for what they had built. The show's defenders would argue that this is simply what satire does, that the tradition of using public figures and public culture as raw material for comedy is valuable enough to justify the costs, that requiring permission or credit for parody would fundamentally compromise the freedom that makes parody worth protecting. These arguments have real merit. The legal system, as we have seen, has endorsed the core of this position repeatedly. But there is a version of the argument that conflates legal protection with creative imperative that assumes because something is allowed, it must be done that way, without consideration of whether a more thoughtful approach might have achieved the same creative effect with less collateral damage. Family Guy was often funny. It was sometimes genuinely brilliant. It was also, with some regularity, careless about the human beings whose creations and identities it borrowed from, treating their most personal and carefully crafted work as if it were simply floating cultural material with no owner, no history, no personal significance beyond its recognizability. The lawsuits it faced were, in part, a response to that carelessness. Not to the comedy itself, but to the manner of the comedy, the assumption that what was legally permitted was therefore fine in every sense, that the joke's success was justification enough for everything the joke required. Section 28. A final meditation, comedy, ownership, and the American legal tradition. We have now spent an extraordinary amount of time with the lawsuits that grew up around Family Guy, and it is time to bring this journey to its close. But before we arrive at the ending, there is one more reflection worth offering, not a legal analysis, not a biographical sketch, but a meditation on what all of these cases together say about something larger than a television show or a set of copyright rulings. The American legal tradition that protected Family Guy in court is built on a set of premises about what kind of society we want to live in and what values we are willing to pay costs to protect. The premise that parody deserves strong protection is grounded in the conviction that the ability to comment on, critique, and transform existing culture is essential to how culture grows and how democratic discourse functions. The premise that public figures have reduced privacy interests in their public personas is grounded in the conviction that people who seek power and public attention must accept scrutiny and commentary that private individuals can refuse. The premise that copyright protects expression but not ideas, that it protects the specific form in which a creative work is expressed but not the concepts or styles or conventions that make it up, is grounded in the conviction that culture is built cumulatively, that every creator builds on what came before, and that locking up cultural building blocks in permanent ownership would impoverish the creative life of society. These premises are not obvious truths. They are choices. Choices that a society makes about what it values and how it resolves the tensions between competing values. Another society might choose differently, might give more weight to the creator's rights, might more aggressively protect the emotional and commercial investment that artists and copyright holders make in their work. The European approach to copyright, as we have noted, is somewhat more protective of rights holders than the American approach, and reasonable people can disagree about which represents the better balance. What is worth noting is that the choices embedded in American law, the choices that protected Family Guy, are not purely abstract or theoretical. They have real effects on real people. Carol Burnett lost her lawsuit and her creation remained in the pornography store. Art Metrano won what he called a very nice settlement, but he had to spend years in court to get there. Born Company lost its attempt to protect a beloved song from being associated with crude stereotypes. These were not costless outcomes for anyone. At the same time, the legal protection that allowed Family Guy to make crude jokes about real people and real songs has also allowed a much broader universe of creative expression, including a great deal of expression that is genuinely important, genuinely critical, genuinely adding something to the cultural conversation to exist without the constant threat of suppression by those who dislike what is being said about them. The same legal framework that let Family Guy use the charwoman without permission also protects satirists and critics who take on powerful institutions, who use the familiar forms of popular culture to make points about politics and society, who cannot get permission for their commentary because the subjects of that commentary would not give it. The law cannot make those distinctions between the valuable and the trivial, the thoughtful and the careless, the genuinely parodic and the merely appropriative. It applies the same standard fair use analysis, First Amendment protection to all of them, because the alternative of having courts make case-by-case aesthetic judgments about the value of different parodies is worse than the occasionally crude results that the broad rule produces. Family Guy is the most improbable example of a show that has benefited from and helped define these important legal principles. It is a cartoon about a fictional family in a fictional Rhode Island town, and its most legally significant episodes involve a cleaning lady in a pornography store, a parody of a Disney song about stars and wishes, and a cartoon Jesus doing fake magic tricks. Not exactly the heroic narrative of free speech, and yet, the principles that protected Family Guy in court are real principles, with real value. The parody doctrine matters. The First Amendment matters. The ability of comedy to borrow from and comment on and sometimes brutally mock the culture it grows out of, that matters too, even when the comedy is crude, even when it costs real people something. even when a federal judge has to use the word distasteful while explaining why it is protected. So we hold both things at once. Family Guy was allowed to do what it did, and Family Guy could have been kinder. The law was right, and the jokes were sometimes unnecessarily cruel. The First Amendment protected something worth protecting, and the show sometimes abused the protection it was given. All of those things are true simultaneously. That is perhaps the most honest conclusion this long journey through the lawsuits can offer. Not a verdict, not a ruling, but an acknowledgement of the genuine complexity of what happens when a show built on aggression and provocation goes up against a legal system built on the protection of expression, and both win and both lose, and real people bear the costs of both outcomes. Thank you for spending this time with these stories. The law is most interesting when it touches on something human, and the Family Guy lawsuits touch on some of the most human things there are the desire to protect what you made, the desire to be respected for what you built, the desire to have your most personal traditions treated with some dignity by people who did not live them. Those desires ran up against a wall of First Amendment protection, and the wall mostly held, and the jokes survived, and the people who brought them to court mostly went home having lost. But they were heard. The courts heard them, and now you have heard them too. That matters, even when the outcome cannot change. If this journey through the legal history of America's most sued cartoon brought you something a clearer sense of how copyright works, a deeper appreciation for the people behind the lawsuits, or simply a long and relaxed immersion in detailed storytelling that gave you something to drift along with, then it accomplished what it set out to do. Please subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment. Tell me what time it is and where you are in the world. And sleep well, wherever you are. The show goes on. It always does.